Clara Whitmore pressed both hands flat against the stagecoach door and pushed herself upright before anyone could offer to help her, because no one was going to offer, and she had learned a long time ago that waiting for kindness from strangers was just another way of choosing to be disappointed. She stepped down onto the dirt road of Red Hollow, Colorado, with her worn suitcase hanging from one hand and a crumpled letter clutched in the other, and she stood there in the summer heat of 1883, looking for a face she had memorized from a photograph, a man named Douglas Hale, who had written her 7 letters across 3 months, who had called her warm and capable, and exactly the kind of woman a man builds a life with, and who was supposed to be standing right here waiting for her. He was not standing here. No one was standing here for her. If you've ever been chosen last or not chosen at all, stay with me. Subscribe to this channel right now, hit that notification bell, and drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Because what happens next in Red Hollow, Colorado, is something none of us were prepared for, least of all Clara Whitmore. She read the letter again, though she already knew every word of it by heart. She had read it on the train through Kansas. She had read it again somewhere in the flat grasslands, before the land started rising toward the mountains. She had read it a third time that morning, half hoping the words would rearrange themselves into something that didn't mean what they meant. They never did. Miss Whitmore. The letter began in handwriting that had grown noticeably smaller and more cramped since his earlier letters, as though the man writing it was trying to take up less space on the page. I write to inform you that circumstances have changed considerably since my last correspondence. I have entered into a prior arrangement with a woman of this community, and it would not be appropriate for me to proceed with our agreement. I trust you will understand the necessity of this decision and make suitable arrangements for your return. I am sorry for any inconvenience this may cause. Inconvenience. Clara folded the letter slowly along its creases and tucked it into the front pocket of her traveling coat. She was 27 years old. She had sold most of her furniture. She had given up her room at the boarding house in Wichita. She had spent 11 days on coaches and trains with everything she owned packed into one suitcase, and the man who had promised her a home had written her a letter that called her an inconvenience. She breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth the way her mother had taught her when she was a little girl, and the world felt like it was pressing in too hard from every direction. She was not going to cry in the middle of a street in a town where she didn't know a single soul. She was not. The main street of Red Hollow was wide and sun-beaten, the kind of frontier town that hadn't quite decided yet whether it intended to grow into something or dry up and disappear. There was a general store, a post office, a barber shop, 2 saloons that faced each other across the road like men deciding whether or not to draw, a feed supply depot, a church with a crooked steeple, a handful of women in calico dresses moving between storefronts, and a group of men sitting outside the barber shop who had already noticed her. She could tell by the way they'd stopped talking. Clara set her suitcase down beside her feet and smoothed the front of her dress with both hands. She was a big woman, had been her whole life, and she wore her size the way a person wears something they've made peace with after a long argument. It was part of her the same way her dark brown hair was part of her, the same way the stubborn line of her jaw was part of her. She did not slouch. She did not fold herself small to take up less room. She stood straight-backed and square-shouldered because her mother had raised her to stand that way. And she was not about to let Douglas Hale's letter rob her of that too. One of the women from the church auxiliary had drifted close enough to hear the stagecoach driver hand over her trunk receipt, and Clara caught the woman looking at her, the way people sometimes did a long, slow assessment that started at the hem of her dress and moved upward with the careful measuring expression of someone deciding exactly how much sympathy to allocate. "You Miss Whitmore?" the woman asked. She was somewhere in her 50s, thin as wire, with sharp eyes under a bonnet that had seen better decades. "I am," Clara said. "You're the one Douglas Hale sent for." There it was. Already. Clara felt the particular kind of stillness that settles into a person when they understand that their private humiliation has already become public knowledge. "That's correct," she said, keeping her voice even. The woman pressed her lips together. "Well." She glanced toward the women behind her, who had all found sudden interest in the space just to the left of Clara's head. He married Vera DuPont last Saturday. The ceremony was at the church. Half the town was there. She paused as if the weight of the information required space on either side of it. I suppose you didn't know. I received his letter, Clara said. Eventually. Well? The woman said well again the way people do when they've run out of words but still have more to say. I imagine that's quite a journey to have made for nothing. For nothing. Clara picked up her suitcase. Thank you for the information, ma'am, she said, and she turned and walked down the street because she needed to be moving, because standing still was starting to feel dangerous in a way she couldn't quite name. Behind her, she could hear the murmur starting the low-running current of voices that means a town is beginning to talk. She didn't turn around. She just kept walking, her suitcase in her hand, and 11 days of travel in her bones, and a letter in her pocket that had called her an inconvenience, and she was looking for a hotel or a boarding house or any place at all that would let her sit down in private and figure out what came next. She found the hotel. It was called the Red Hollow Inn, which was generous because it was 3 rooms above a dry goods store and smelled like sawdust and something that had been cooking too long. The man behind the counter was young, maybe 19, with the soft, uncertain look of someone who had recently been trusted with a responsibility he wasn't sure he deserved. He looked up when she came in, and she watched the progression cross his face. The first look, which was neutral. Then the second look, which was the one people gave when they were recalibrating something. And then he collected himself and said, "Help you." "I need a room," Clara said. "For a few nights, possibly a week. I'll pay in advance." $1.50 a night, he said. "No cooking in the rooms. Washrooms down the hall." "That's fine." She paid him for 3 nights and followed him up a narrow staircase to a room that held a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single window that looked out onto the alley behind the general store. She set her suitcase on the floor. She sat on the edge of the bed. And then, in the complete privacy of a room where no one could see her, she put her face in her hands and she allowed herself exactly 2 minutes to feel the full weight of where she was and how she had gotten here. When the 2 minutes were up, she wiped her face, straightened her spine, and began to think. She had $14 and some cents remaining after the hotel payment. She could not afford to buy a return ticket to Wichita. She could not afford to stay at the hotel past a week. She needed work, and she needed it quickly, and she needed it in a town that had already decided she was a cautionary tale. She sat with that for a moment. Then she got up, washed her face at the washstand, pinned her hair back into order, and went downstairs to ask the boy at the counter if he knew of anyone in Red Hollow who might be looking for a capable cook or housekeeper. The boy thought about it. "There's the hotel in Carver Creek 20 miles east," he said. "They take on kitchen help sometimes." "Here in town?" Clara said. "Or near enough to walk?" He thought some more, scratched the back of his neck. "Well," he said, and she braced herself because nothing good ever followed that word today. "There's the Cole Ranch about 4 miles north on the Ridgeline Road. Rancher named Nathan Cole. His pa's been real sick, I hear. They've been through 2 housekeepers already this year. But—" He trailed off. "But what?" Clara asked. The boy looked uncomfortable. "People say Mr. Cole ain't the easiest man to work for since his wife passed. He don't talk much, don't smile much neither. And his pa, old Sam Cole, well, they say the old man just don't want to live no more. Just sits in his room and refuses to eat. The last woman they hired walked off after 3 days, said she couldn't take the quiet." Clara nodded. 4 miles north on the Ridgeline Road, she repeated. "Yes, ma'am, but—" "Thank you," she said, and went back upstairs to rest before morning. She did not sleep well. The narrow bed creaked every time she shifted, and the sounds of the street below, the saloon music, the occasional holler. The horses kept pulling her back from the edge of sleep. But sometime near midnight, she did finally go under, and she dreamed of her mother's kitchen. The yellow curtains her mother always kept pressed and hanging straight, the smell of onions softening in a pan. The particular sound her mother's spoon made against the side of the pot when she was tasting something and deciding it needed more. She woke up before dawn with that sound still in her ears, and lay still for a moment, listening to Red Hollow in the last quiet before morning. Then she got up dressed and went downstairs. She walked the 4 miles to the coal ranch in the early morning, while the sky was still that deep flat blue that happens in the half hour before the sun actually clears the horizon. The ridgeline road was rutted and dry, and her traveling boots were not made for this much walking, and by the 2nd mile, the left one had developed a place at the heel that was going to become a blister before long. She kept walking. The coal ranch came into view as the sun finally broke over the ridge. A main house, 2 barns, a bunkhouse that looked like it hadn't held a full crew in some time, fencing that ran out in both directions as far as she could see. It was a substantial spread. Or it had been. The kind of place that had once required real attention and was now wearing its neglect the way a person wears grief, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the accumulated small details. A gate hinge that needed replacing. A window shutter hanging at the wrong angle. A flower bed along the front of the house that had been planted with care once and had been left to its own devices for long enough that it had given up trying to be a flower bed and was just a patch of ground now. She stood at the gate for a moment and looked at the house. The curtains were drawn. No smoke yet from the kitchen chimney. Somewhere behind one of the barns, a dog was barking at something. Clara opened the gate and walked up to the front door and knocked. Nothing. She knocked again harder. The door opened so abruptly that she stepped back, and the man standing in the doorway was not what she had expected, though she couldn't have said precisely what she had expected. He was tall, taller than she'd imagined from the boy's description, with the lean, hard build of someone who had spent a large portion of his life outdoors doing physical work. He was maybe 35, dark-haired, with 2 or 3 days of stubble on his jaw, and eyes the color of creek water in October gray-green and cold and thoroughly uninterested. He was dressed like he'd been awake for a while. Shirt, tucked boots on, but his expression was the expression of a man who had answered his door before dawn, and had never once been glad he did. He looked at her for a long moment without speaking. "Mr. Cole," Clara said. "My name is Clara Whitmore. I arrived in Red Hollow yesterday. I understand you're in need of a cook and housekeeper. I'm looking for work." The pause that followed was long enough that she had time to consider exactly how she looked, standing here, a woman she didn't know this town, with a suitcase 4 miles back at a hotel, asking a stranger for a job before the sun had finished rising. She kept her chin level and her eyes on his. "Word travels fast in a small town," he said. His voice was lower than she'd expected, unhurried like a man who had decided a long time ago that he was only going to say things once. "You're the woman Hale sent for." "I was," Clara said. "I'm not anymore. Now I'm a woman looking for work." Something shifted in his face, not warmth exactly, but a kind of reconsideration. He studied her for another moment. "You know how to cook?" he asked. "Since I was 8 years old," she said. "Bread soups, stews, pies, preserved goods. I can manage a kitchen, keep a house in order, and handle whatever a household requires. I work hard, and I'm not easily discouraged." 2 women walked off this job already, he said. One stayed 3 days. The other lasted a week. "I heard," Clara said. "I'm not them." He looked at her again. A different kind of look. This time the kind that was actually trying to see something. And then he stepped back from the door. "Come in then," he said. "I'll show you the kitchen." The kitchen was worse than she'd imagined from the outside. It wasn't dirty exactly, more like it had been existing in a state of suspension, like everything in it had been set down one day and never picked up again. The wood stove had a layer of ash built up past what was useful. The shelves held provisions, but in no particular order: cans and dry goods, mixed without logic, a sack of flour with the top twisted shut that hadn't been opened in long enough to have gone slightly stiff. The table in the center of the room had the remains of what had been some time ago someone's attempt at a meal: a plate, a cup, a spoon, the whole arrangement slightly stiff with age. Nathan Cole stood in the doorway behind her and said nothing. "Your provisions," Clara said. "Can you tell me what you have and where it's kept?" "What's on the shelves is what there is," he said. "Beef's in the cellar. There's a kitchen garden out back, or there was, I haven't kept it up. All right, Clara said. She was already looking at the stove, already thinking about heat and timing, and what she could have ready by the time a sick old man might be hungry. What does your father eat? What did he eat before? The pause this time had a different quality to it. He used to eat everything, Nathan said. Ma's cooking mostly. She made good bread, bean soups. He stopped. Does he have any difficulty eating, swallowing, digesting? Not physically, Nathan said. He just, another stop. He won't come to the table. He won't eat what's brought to him. He let the sentence go, and she understood from the way he left it unfinished that this was not something he had found language for yet. When did your mother pass? Clara asked. 6 years ago, he said. My wife 2 years after that. She turned and looked at him. Then, because that was the kind of information that deserved to be looked at directly, and she saw in his face for just a moment, underneath the flatness, underneath the controlled quiet, something that was very tired and had been tired for a long time. Then it was gone, and he was just a man standing in a kitchen doorway again. I'll need a few hours to get this kitchen sorted and a meal started, Clara said. Is there anything I should know about your father before I bring something to his room? He'll tell you to leave, Nathan said. First time, second time, maybe the third. Don't take it personally. He tells everyone to leave. All right, Clara said. Nathan looked at her for a moment longer, like he was waiting for a follow-up question she hadn't asked. When it didn't come, he nodded once, something between acknowledgement and approval. Wages are $12 a month, he said. Room and board included. There's a small room off the kitchen. That's acceptable, Clara said. I'll be out at the south fence most of the morning, he said. My ranch hand. Hector's somewhere around the barn if you need anything. He turned to go. Mr. Cole, she said. He stopped. Thank you for the work, she said. He didn't answer right away. Just stood there with his back to her for a breath, 2 breaths. Don't thank me yet, he said. Nobody's lasted past a week. And then he was gone, and Clara was alone in the kitchen, and it was barely 6 in the morning, and she had a great deal of work to do. She started with the stove. There was something almost meditative about the process of clearing an ash bed that had built up past usefulness, scraping the firebox clean, laying new tinder and kindling with the care it deserved. Not in a hurry because a fire started. In a hurry was a fire that went out in a hurry and then feeding in the first good log and watching the flame take hold. She stood there for a moment after it caught, just watching the light change inside the firebox, feeling the first small wave of heat. Her mother used to say that a kitchen without a fire in the stove was just a room, and a room without food cooking was just walls. Clara began to move. She sorted the shelves while the stove came up to temperature, organizing the provisions by type, and used pulling out what was stale or past its usefulness, assessing what she had to work with. Dried beans, good. Salt pork, fine. Cornmeal, flour that was still sound despite the stiff sack. Canned tomatoes, 3 tins. Dried herbs, sage thyme, something that had been bay leaves and was now mostly just brown paper. She found onions in a sack near the door, more dried out than ideal, but serviceable. In the cellar, she found the beef Nathan had mentioned well wrapped and cold. She made biscuits first because biscuits were fast and their smell was the most immediate thing a kitchen could produce, that warm, yeasty golden smell that meant something good was happening. And then she put a pot of bean soup on slow and covered with the salt pork and a handful of the dried herbs and both onions chopped fine. She checked the kitchen garden and found it had not entirely given up. There were some straggly carrots and a few stalks of what had been celery enough to add to the soup, and some wild green onions growing along the fence that she pulled with her hands and washed at the pump. By the time the biscuits came out of the oven, the soup had been going for 2 hours and had filled the kitchen with a smell that was moving through the rest of the house, whether the house wanted it to or not. Clara put 4 biscuits on a plate, ladled a bowl of soup, poured a cup of water from the pump pitcher, and carried all of it down the hallway to the room she'd been told was Samuel Cole's. She knocked. No answer. She knocked again. Mr. Cole, she said through the door. "My name is Clara Whitmore. I'm the new cook. I've brought you some breakfast." "Go away." The voice from inside the room was old and thin, but it had steel in it. The voice of a man who had once been accustomed to being obeyed and had not entirely forgotten it. "I'll leave it at the door then," Clara said, "so you can get it when you're ready. Biscuits and bean soup. The biscuits are best while they're still warm." Silence. She set the tray on the floor in front of the door and went back to the kitchen. 3 hours later, when she went to check, the tray was gone. The plate was empty. The bowl was empty. Someone had drunk all the water. Clara permitted herself one small, quiet moment of satisfaction. Then she started on the bread for supper. She did not see Nathan Cole until late afternoon, when he came through the back door with the particular weariness of a man who had been doing hard outdoor work since before dawn. He stopped in the kitchen doorway the same way he'd stopped in it that morning. But this time, the kitchen was different. Clean, warm smelling of fresh bread and something savory on the stove, and for just a fraction of a second before his face went flat again, she saw him register the difference. "Supper'll be ready in about an hour," she said without turning from the stove. "Your father ate this morning. I left a tray outside his door and he took it in." A long pause. "He ate," Nathan said. "The plate was clean when I retrieved it," Clara said. Another pause longer. "He hasn't eaten more than a few bites at a time in 3 months," Nathan said. "I know bean soup," Clara said simply. "My mother used to make it the same way. Something about it," she paused, considering how to say it. "It doesn't feel like being expected to eat. It just feels like warmth." She heard him move a slight shift of weight, the creak of a floorboard. "I'll wash up," he said after a moment, and she heard him move away down the hallway. She allowed herself to exhale. The supper she set on the table that evening was simple. The fresh bread, a beef stew she'd put together in the afternoon with the cellar stock, and the garden vegetables, some of the remaining biscuits warm in a cloth. She set 3 places at the table, which she knew was presumptuous, but she set them anyway, because somewhere in the doing of it, she had made a decision about what kind of household this was going to be. Nathan came to the table. He sat down across from the place she'd set for herself, and she sat down, and they ate without speaking for a while, and the silence was not a comfortable silence, but it was a working silence, the kind that 2 people produce when they are both occupied with figuring out what they are to each other. "You set a 3rd place," he said. "I did," Clara said. "He won't come," Nathan said. "Then we'll save him a plate," Clara said. Nathan looked at her across the table. He had the look of a man who had long since stopped expecting to be surprised by anything, and was now being surprised anyway, and wasn't quite sure what to do about it. He went back to eating. After supper, when she was clearing the table, she heard a sound in the hallway. Slow, deliberate footsteps, the careful, measured gait of someone who hadn't been walking much and knew it. She kept her back to the hallway and her hands busy with the dishes. The footsteps stopped in the kitchen doorway. She still didn't turn around. "You the one that made that soup?" said the old voice. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir," Clara said. A silence. "My wife used to put green onion in hers," he said. "Wild ones." "So did my mother," Clara said. Another silence longer. "What did you say your name was?" "Clara," she said. "Clara Whitmore." Said Samuel Cole. And she heard him turn and move back down the hallway, slow and deliberate, the same way he'd come. She stood at the sink, with her hands in the wash water for a long moment after the sound of him faded. Then she kept washing dishes. When Nathan came back through the kitchen later to bank the stove for the night, she was sitting at the kitchen table with a mug of tea going over in her head, what she would need from the general store in town to properly stock the kitchen for a week's worth of cooking. He stopped when he saw her. "You're still up," he said with a slight note of something that wasn't quite surprise, more like he had been expecting her to be gone already, the way the others had been, and was recalibrating now that she wasn't. "I was thinking about a grocery list," she said. "I'll need some things from town if you can spare someone to make the trip, or I can go myself." "Hector goes in Thursday," he said. "Give him a list." "All right." She looked down at the list she'd been making in her head, and started writing it properly on a piece of paper from her apron pocket. He stood there for a moment more. She could feel him standing there in the way you can feel a large, quiet presence in a room, the way weather feels before it arrives. Then he said, "My father came out of his room." "I know," she said. "He hasn't done that in 4 months," Nathan said. She kept writing. "He smelled the soup," she said. "People follow what they remember loving." The silence that followed was the longest yet, and she did not fill it, and eventually she heard him move to the stove and begin the process of banking it for the night. "Clara Whitmore," he said without turning around. "Mr. Cole," she said. "Nathan," he said. "If you're going to be in this house, you might as well use my name." "All right," she said. "Nathan." He finished with the stove, set the kettle off the heat, turned down the lamp. "Good night," he said. "Good night," she said. And she sat in the dimming kitchen, listening to his footsteps move down the hall and up the stairs. And she thought 4 miles from a hotel where she had a room paid for 3 nights, and a town that had already made up its mind about her, and a kitchen that had been empty for months, and now smelled like bread and something good. She didn't know yet what Red Hollow was going to mean for her. She didn't know what Nathan Cole was, or what Samuel Cole was, or what this quiet, worn-down ranch was going to ask of her in the weeks ahead. But she had made a man eat today who hadn't wanted to eat. She had walked into a cold kitchen and made it warm. She had done what she knew how to do in the only way she knew how to do it, and it had been enough. For tonight, she decided that was sufficient. She finished her tea, rinsed her mug, and went to her room off the kitchen. A small room, plain with a window that looked out on the back of the property. And she lay down on the narrow bed. And she listened to the sounds of the ranch settling into the night. And she thought about her mother's kitchen, and the sound of a spoon against the side of a pot, and how some things traveled further than a person expected them to. She was asleep before she finished the thought, and in his room down the hall, Samuel Cole lay in his bed in the dark, and thought about wild green onions and soup that tasted like something he used to know, and whether or not that same woman would be there in the morning when he woke up. He thought it was possible that she would be. He wasn't sure yet whether that meant anything. But he fell asleep thinking about it, which was more than he'd done in a long time. She was back in the kitchen before sunrise. That was the first thing Nathan noticed. Not that the stove was already going. Not that the smell of coffee had found its way up the stairs and pulled him out of the first solid sleep he'd had in weeks. But that when he came down in the gray pre-dawn dark, there were already dishes in the drying rack, which meant she had been up long enough to have washed dishes, which meant she had been awake even longer than that. He stood in the kitchen doorway in his socks and looked at her back and said nothing. Clara was standing at the stove with a long-handled spoon, stirring something in a pot she'd found God knows where, moving with the unhurried efficiency of a woman who had been doing this particular thing in the particular way for so long that her body knew the motions without consulting her mind. She was humming something low under her breath. Not quite a song, more like the sound a person makes when they are content enough that sound has started happening without their permission. She did not startle when he came in, did not turn around. "Coffee's on the side shelf," she said. "I found a bag that still had some grind in it, but you'll want to get more from town when Hector goes Thursday. And there's oatmeal about 5 minutes away from being ready if you want to sit." He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat at the table. The oatmeal, when she set it in front of him, had dried apricots in it that she must have found somewhere at the back of the provisions shelf and reconstituted overnight, and a line of brown sugar across the top that was already melting into the cream she'd poured alongside it. He ate without speaking. She sat across from him with her own bowl and her own coffee, and ate without speaking too, and the kitchen had the particular quiet of a house that is starting very slowly, and without announcing it to come back to something. When he was done, he pushed the bowl back slightly. "You find the apricots," he said. "Behind the canned goods," she said. "They were in a paper sack nearly all the way to the wall. Been there a while." "My wife put them up," he said. "2 summers ago before she—" He stopped. Clara did not fill the silence, and she did not look away. She just sat there with her coffee cup in both hands and let the silence be what it was. Nathan looked at the table. "She liked apricots," he said. Said they were the only thing worth preserving in this altitude. She was right about the altitude, Clara said, and about the apricots. He almost smiled. Not quite. But the expression that crossed his face was close enough that she saw it, and she filed it away privately, the way she had been filing things away since she arrived. The small shifts, the minute changes. The way this man's face sometimes almost did something before it stopped. "I'm going to check on your father this morning," she said, moving the conversation forward because she understood he needed it to move. "I want to ask him what he'd like for his midday meal, if he'll tell me." Nathan was quiet for a moment. "He won't," he said. "He might," she said. "He came out of his room last night." "I know." "That means something opened," she said. "I'd like to find out what it is before it closes again." Nathan looked at her across the table. That look. He had the one that was still deciding something. Then he nodded once, and stood and took his hat off the hook by the door. He left without further conversation, and Clara finished her coffee and washed the bowls, and then walked down the hallway and knocked on Samuel Cole's door. "Go away," said the old man. "Good morning, Mr. Cole," Clara said. "I'm about to start the midday meal, and I'd like to know if there's something you'd prefer. I have beef and beans, and I can make bread if you want it." A long pause. "I don't want anything," he said. "All right," she said. "I'll make bread anyway in case you change your mind. I'll leave a plate at the door, same as yesterday." Another pause. "You don't listen very well," he said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite as flat as the words. "I listen fine," Clara said. "I just don't always agree." The silence that followed was long enough that she almost turned and walked back to the kitchen. Then she heard something from inside the room, a creak, a slow shift of weight, the sound of a man sitting up in a bed that had held him for too long. "What kind of bread?" Samuel said. She kept her expression neutral, though there was no one in the hallway to see it. "The same as yesterday," she said. "White bread from scratch. I can add some rosemary if there's any left in the garden. I found some still growing along the south side." Another silence. "My wife grew rosemary," he said. "I know," Clara said. "I could smell it in the soil when I was looking through the garden. She planted it somewhere it would get full sun, which was smart. Rosemary likes to be warm." She heard him breathing slow, deliberate, the breath of a man who was doing something effortful, though what that effort was, she could not have named precisely. Making a decision, maybe, or choosing to believe something. "All right," he said finally. "Bread." "I'll have it ready by midday," she said, and walked back to the kitchen. She made the bread. She made a pot of beef broth, as well rich and slow, with some of the garden carrots, and the last of the wild green onions, and a piece of bone she'd found in the cellar that still had enough marrow in it to be worth using. She kept the kitchen stove steady, not too hot, not fluctuating the way her mother had always said. You had to keep it if you wanted bread to rise right, because heat was honest. It gave back exactly what you gave it. While the bread was in its second rise, Hector came in through the back door. He was a compact man in his 40s, dark-haired and weathered, with the direct, unhurried manner of someone who had spent most of his life outdoors, and had come to an understanding with the world on those terms. He came in looking for coffee, saw Clara at the table working on the grocery list for Thursday, and stopped. "Morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. "Coffee's still hot. The cups are on the left side shelf." He poured himself a cup and leaned against the counter the way men do when they're not sure whether they've been given permission to sit. "You're the new one," he said. "Clara Whitmore," she said. "Hector Reyes," he said. "I run the hands when there are any. Right now it's just me and 2 boys from the Malone property on Wednesdays." He looked around the kitchen in a way that was trying not to be obvious. "This place smells different," he said. "Bread," she said. "And broth." "Yeah." He drank some coffee, looked at her grocery list. "That for Thursday?" "If it's not too long," she said. He looked at it more carefully. "Oats, cornmeal salt pork, 2 pounds of sugar, lard dried apples." He looked up. "You know Nathan don't spend much on food." "He will now," she said simply. Hector looked at her for a moment with the slight careful attention of a man who had worked for Nathan Cole long enough to have opinions about the women who came and went in this kitchen. "The last one lasted a week," he said. "The one before 3 days." "I know," Clara said. "I'm not them." He was quiet for a moment, drinking his coffee. Then, "Old Sam came to the kitchen doorway this morning," he said. "After you came back from knocking on his door. I saw him through the window. He stood there about a minute and then went back down the hall." Clara looked up from her list. "He didn't come in," Hector said. "But he came to the doorway." She held that for a moment. 4 months, Nathan had said, since his father had eaten properly. And now the man was standing in kitchen doorways, following the smell of bread and broth through a house that had forgotten how to smell like anything. "He'll come in," she said. Hector looked at her with something she couldn't quite name, not skepticism, not hope, something in between. "You sound sure," he said. "I'm not sure about much," Clara said honestly. "But I know what it means when a man comes to a doorway. It means part of him has already decided." Hector finished his coffee, rinsed the cup, set it in the drying rack. "I'll be out by the east barn if you need anything," he said, and went back out the door. Clara shaped the bread loaves, slid them into the oven, and sat down to finish her list. The morning moved around her in its rhythms, the sound of work happening somewhere out behind the barns, a horse responding to something, the creak and shift of the house in the heat that was beginning to build as the sun rose higher. She had set a plate at Samuel's door at midday, same as the day before, 2 thick slices of the rosemary bread, a bowl of the broth, with some soft cooked carrot in it, a small square of the preserved butter she'd found in the cold cellar. She came back an hour later to find it gone again. The plate was not just emptied this time, it had been moved. Not left where she'd put it on the floor. It had been carried a few feet down the hallway, set neatly against the baseboard, as if someone had brought it out with the intention of carrying it further and then thought better of it. Clara picked up the plate and the bowl and stood in the hallway for a moment, looking at the faint line in the dust on the floor, the mark of where something had been set down and picked up and carried and set down again. She carried the dishes back to the kitchen. She did not say anything to anyone about what she had found. That evening she set 3 places at the table again. Nathan came in at the usual time, washed up, sat down. He looked at the 3rd place setting with the same expression he'd had the night before, a look that had not quite decided whether it was hopeful or resigned, and said nothing. Clara brought the supper to the table. She had made a proper meal this time, the beef stew again, but differently seasoned with dried red pepper and sage, and a handful of the preserved tomatoes she'd found in the cellar that she'd almost missed because they were stacked behind something else. Fresh bread, a small pot of cooked dried apples with some of the brown sugar. She sat down. They ate in the quiet that was becoming something like their quiet, now not comfortable exactly, but not uncomfortable either. The quiet of 2 people who were learning each other's rhythms by proximity rather than conversation. She was about to get up to bring the cooked apples to the table when she heard it. Footsteps in the hallway. Slow ones. The deliberate, measured gait of a man who had not walked this far in a long time and was using all his concentration to do it right. She did not look up. She kept her eyes on her plate. Beside her, she felt rather than saw Nathan go very still. The footsteps stopped at the kitchen doorway. She looked up then. Samuel Cole was standing in the doorway in his nightshirt and a pair of suspenders he'd pulled on over it, with his white hair uncombed and his eyes moving between the table and the window and the stove with the expression of a man who had been away from something for a long time and was trying to remember where everything was. He was thinner than she had expected. From his voice, the voice had more substance to it than the man currently did. He was leaning slightly against the doorframe, not with his whole weight, but enough to say that standing this long was an effort. Nathan's fork was completely still in his hand. "Pa," he said, and his voice did something on that one word that Clara had not heard it do before. Something young and worn out and trying and grateful all at once. Samuel looked at the table, at the 3 place settings. He looked at Clara. "You set a place for me," he said. "I set a place for you yesterday too," she said. "You didn't come then." "No," he agreed. "I didn't." He looked at the empty chair, at the bread on the table, at the pot of cooked apples sitting near the center where the steam was still rising from it. "That apples," he said. "Cooked with brown sugar," she said. "The way my mother made them. Eleanor made them the same way," he said. And she knew without asking that Eleanor was his wife. He looked at Nathan. Nathan looked back at him across the table with the expression of someone holding very, very still because they don't want to disturb something fragile. Samuel pushed himself off the doorframe and walked to the table. He walked slowly, and he walked carefully, like a man relearning the length of his own legs, and he pulled out the chair, and he sat down in it, and the sound of that chair scraping on the kitchen floor and accepting his weight was the loudest thing in the room. Clara reached over and passed him the bread without saying anything. He took it, tore a piece, put it in his mouth, put it in his. He chewed, he swallowed. He looked at nothing in particular for a moment, and then he said very quietly, "That's good bread." "Thank you," Clara said. "She put rosemary in it," Nathan said to his father. He said it like he was offering something, a piece of information, a small gift, something to build on. Samuel looked at the bread in his hand. "Eleanor grew rosemary," he said, "along the south side of the house, said it needed full sun." "I know," Clara said. "I found it still growing there." Samuel looked at her across the table. He had gray eyes lighter than Nathan's, with the particular depth of someone who had lived long enough to have seen things they couldn't unsee. He was looking at her now, the way you look at something unexpected, not with distrust exactly, but with the careful attention of a man who had stopped expecting to be surprised, and was now being surprised, and needed to take the measure of it. "You're the one Hale sent for," he said. "I was," Clara said. "I'm the one who stayed." A silence. Something moved across Samuel's face, too quick to identify, too old for easy naming. Then he turned back to his plate and began to eat. And Nathan Cole across the table looked at Clara Whitmore over the rim of his water glass with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Something that was not quite speechless, and not quite grateful, and not quite something else. But was she thought all three of those things at once, and more besides? She looked back at her own plate. She was not going to make this into more than it was tonight. Tonight was a man coming to a table. Tonight was bread and stew and cooked apples. Tonight was three people sitting in a kitchen that had not held three people at a meal in a long, long time. It was enough. For tonight, it was more than enough. The week that followed moved in a pattern she began to understand, and then to rely on. Samuel came to the table for supper every night after that first night. Not consistently, not easily. Sometimes arriving at the table, already sitting down, before she fully registered that he had come. Sometimes stopping in the doorway so long she thought he might turn back, but he came. Each time felt like a small, improbable miracle that she refused to take for granted. She had learned things about him by then. That he had been a ranch foreman before Nathan's spread became what it was, and that the land had originally been his, passed to Nathan, when his legs started to give him trouble 3 years ago. That he had married Eleanor Marsh in 1848, 35 years ago, in a church that no longer existed in a town that had been absorbed by the railroad expansion. That he had a particular opinion about the right ratio of salt pork to beans that he expressed once unprompted while she was cooking, and which she took to heart and adjusted accordingly. She had also learned that he watched her. Not unkindly. Not with the assessing look people sometimes gave her, the one that started at her size and worked its way around to everything else. He watched her the way a person watches something they are still deciding about, with the full focused attention of someone who has learned that decisions made too quickly in either direction tend to require revision. One afternoon, while she was rolling out pie crust at the kitchen table, and he was sitting in the chair by the window he'd started coming to in the afternoons, the one that got the western light, he said without preamble, "Where'd you learn to cook?" "My mother," she said. "She ran the kitchen for a hotel in Wichita for 12 years. I learned everything from her." "She's still living?" "No," Clara said. She passed 4 years ago. A pause. You got family? He asked. Not to speak of, she said. An aunt in Missouri I've written to twice in my life. A cousin somewhere in Iowa I've never met. She pressed the heel of her hand into the dough, turned it pressed again. I've mostly been on my own. Said Samuel, which was his primary form of response to most things. What about you? She said. You have other children besides Nathan. Had a daughter? He said. Mary. She died young. Fever when she was 11. He said it the way people say things they have said many times, where the grief is still there, but has been worn smooth by repetition. Nathan's all I got left. He works hard, Clara said. Too hard, Samuel said. Since Anna died, that was his wife. He works like if he stops moving he'll have to think about things. Man can't outwork his grief. I've tried. She kept rolling the dough. How long since you've been out of your room? She asked. Before this week. He was quiet for a moment. 4 months, he said. Maybe close to 5. After the second housekeeper left and Nathan stopped pretending he was going to eat supper. He stopped. It seemed easier, he said finally, to stop expecting things. When you stop expecting things, you stop being disappointed. That's not living, Clara said. That's just waiting. The silence that followed was the particular silence of a man who knows he has just been told the truth and is deciding whether to be offended by it or not. No, Samuel said eventually. I suppose it ain't. She put the pie in the oven. She poured him a cup of coffee and set it on the windowsill near his chair. He took it without comment. Why did you stay? He said when she was about to leave the kitchen. After what Hale did. You could have gone back. She stopped. Thought about the 11 days on trains and coaches, the letter in her pocket, the word inconvenience. I had nowhere to go back to, she said. And going back means going back empty-handed. She turned to face him. I've spent most of my life being told I wasn't quite enough of something. Too big, too quiet, too much trouble. I came out here to start something new. She paused. I just started it differently than I planned. Samuel looked at her across the kitchen with those light gray eyes. Nathan's a good man, he said. He ain't easy, but he's good. I know, she said. He notices things, Samuel said. Takes him a while to say them, but he notices. She did not know exactly what to do with that, so she did the only thing she knew how to do. She nodded once and went back to watching the pie. The first real trouble came on a Thursday. Hector had taken the wagon into Red Hollow with Clara's grocery list, and she had expected him back by mid-afternoon. When he came through the back door at nearly 4 o'clock, she could tell from the set of his shoulders before he'd even taken off his hat that something had happened in town. What is it? She said. He set the supplies on the table, started unloading without looking at her directly. People talking, he said. About what? He was quiet for a moment. About you, he said. About you being out here. Clara kept her hands busy sorting the provisions. What kind of talking? She said. The kind that starts at the general store and ends up at the barber shop by afternoon, he said. He paused, picked up a sack of cornmeal, put it on the shelf. Mabel Greer, you meet her when you got off the stage, thin woman bonnet. I met her, Clara said. She's been telling people that Nathan took you in out of pity, Hector said. On account of you having nowhere else to go. And Margaret Pierce, she runs the church auxiliary, she's been saying it ain't appropriate a single woman living on a man's property. He stopped. Set a jar of lard on the counter. They're calling you a charity case. Clara continued sorting the supplies. Her hands were very steady. They don't know you, Hector said, and there was something in his voice that was trying to be consolation and was also just honest. No, Clara said. They don't. Nathan's going to hear it, Hector said, if he hasn't already. She had thought about this. She had been thinking about it since the first morning in town, since Mabel Greer's face, and the word inconvenience, and the low murmur of voices that followed her down the main street. She had known it was coming. Let him hear it, she said. Hector looked at her. A man decides what he believes, she said. Not what other people tell him to believe. If Nathan Cole has questions about why I'm here, or what I'm worth, he can ask me himself. Hector was quiet for a moment. Then he made a sound that was almost a laugh, not amusement, exactly more like the sound of a man acknowledging something well said. He finished unloading the supplies and left her to put them away. Nathan came in for supper that evening and said nothing about it. He sat at the table the way he always sat, ate the way he always ate, passed the bread to his father without being asked, because he had started to know that his father would want a second piece. And Clara sat across from him and watched his face, and saw nothing there that told her one way or another whether Mabel Greer's words had reached him. After supper, Samuel went back to his room earlier than usual, which meant he was tired and had decided to be honest about it, which she privately counted as progress. She was washing dishes when Nathan came back into the kitchen after walking his father down the hall. He sat down at the table, didn't speak right away. Clara kept washing. "Hector told you what's being said in town?" he said. "He did," she said. "I heard it from Clem Dawes when I rode in to file the water rights paperwork this morning," Nathan said, before Hector even got there. She turned from the sink and dried her hands on the towel. "I want you to know something," Nathan said. He was looking at the table, not at her, with the expression of a man who has been working out how to say something for several hours and is still not entirely confident in the arrangement. "I didn't hire you out of pity." "I know that," she said. "I hired you because my father was dying," he said. "Not from sickness. From—" He stopped, pressed his thumb against the table edge. "From not wanting to be here anymore. And I didn't know how to reach him. I didn't know how to—" He stopped again. "You don't have to explain yourself to me," Clara said. "I want to," he said, and the plainness of it stopped her. She sat down across from him. "When you showed up at my door that morning," he said, I thought you were just desperate, and I figured maybe that made two of us." He looked up then. "But that wasn't it. You weren't desperate. You were—" He searched for the word. "Determined," he said. "There's a difference." Clara looked at him across the table. "There is," she said. "My father ate 3 full plates tonight," Nathan said. 3 months ago he wouldn't touch a spoon." He looked at her. "You did that." "He did that," she said. "I just gave him a reason to want to." Nathan was quiet for a moment. The lamp between them was turned low, and his face in the half-light had the quality it sometimes got in the evening, less guarded the way faces get when the day's work is done and the body has stopped bracing. "People are going to keep talking," he said. "Yes," she said. "Does that bother you?" She thought about it honestly. "It bothers me the way cold weather bothers me," she said. "I don't like it. I'd prefer it to stop, but I'm not going to stay inside because of it." Something changed in his face. Not a smile, he still hadn't fully smiled, not once in the week she'd been here, but the thing that happened before a smile, the shift that comes right before. "I'll talk to Clem Dawes next time I see him," Nathan said. "You don't need to defend me," she said. "I know I don't need to," he said. "I want to." He paused. "There's a difference." She recognized her own words coming back to her and felt something warm move through her chest, not quite humor, not quite surprise, something gentler than either. "All right," she said. He nodded once and stood and pushed in his chair. "Good night, Clara," he said. "Good night, Nathan," she said. She listened to his footsteps going down the hall, up the stairs, across the ceiling above her. She listened to the house settling. She listened to the night sounds outside, crickets somewhere distant, a coyote, the particular dry silence of a Colorado summer night in the mountains. And she sat with the warm thing in her chest and did not ask it to be more than it was. But she also didn't tell it to go away. The second week was different in ways she felt before she could name them. Samuel started coming to the kitchen in the mornings, not always, not every day, but enough that she began setting his coffee cup on the windowsill before she heard him in the hallway, because she was starting to know the rhythms of his mornings, the way she had known her mother's. He would come in, take the coffee, sit in the chair, look out the window, and talk sometimes, and not talk other times. And she learned that both were fine and did not try to force either direction. One morning he said, "Nathan's going to have to ride to Carver Creek next week. Water rights dispute with the Hollis property on the other side of the ridge." "He mentioned the water rights," Clara said. "He didn't mention the dispute." "He don't mention things that trouble him," Samuel said. "Keeps it inside, always has, since he was a boy." He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "Anna used to drag it out of him. She had a way of asking that didn't feel like asking. He'd think he was just talking, and then realize he'd told her everything." Clara didn't say anything. "You've got a similar quality," Samuel said. "In case you didn't know." She looked up from the bread she was kneading. Samuel was watching her with those light gray eyes. "I wasn't trying to do anything particular," she said. "I know you weren't," he said. "That's what makes it work." She kneaded the bread and didn't answer, but she turned the observation over in her mind several times throughout the morning and left it where it was, which was somewhere she could find it again. Nathan left for Carver Creek on a Monday morning before dawn, which she only knew because she heard his horse before the sun came up and found the kitchen empty when she came downstairs. He had left a note on the table, which surprised her. Not the note's existence, but the fact of it, the consideration of it, the understanding that she would come down and find the kitchen empty, and that he wanted her to know why. Carver Creek for water rights. Back Thursday. Hector knows what's needed. There's beef in the cellar if you need it. N. She folded the note and put it in her apron pocket without examining why she did it. The days he was gone felt longer in a way she was honest enough to notice. The house was quieter, which shouldn't have made a difference, because Nathan Cole was not a loud man. Was in fact one of the quieter men she had ever known. But his absence had a quality to it that she hadn't anticipated. The kitchen felt differently proportioned. The evenings ran at a different pace. Samuel noticed it too, though he expressed this in the particular way Samuel expressed most things obliquely and only once. "He'll be back Thursday," he said on Wednesday evening while she was serving supper. "I know," she said. "You've been checking the road," he said. She set the bread basket down. "I've been watching the weather," she said. It looked like it might rain. Samuel looked at her over his water glass with the expression of a man who has lived long enough to recognize the difference between those two things and is choosing not to press the point. "All right," he said mildly and went back to eating. Nathan came back Thursday afternoon a day earlier than expected, and he came back troubled. She could see it before he got off the horse, the particular set of his shoulders, the way he moved from the saddle to the ground with more force than usual. The expression on his face that was controlled in the way things are controlled when they are under pressure. He came through the back door and stood in the kitchen, and she could see him composing himself deliberately, reaching for the flatness that was his default. "How was it?" she said. "Bad," he said, which was more direct than she'd expected. He hung up his hat. "The Hollis brothers filed an additional claim on the Upper Creek 2 weeks ago. My attorney in town didn't receive notice until after the filing was complete. If it holds—" He stopped, pressed both hands flat on the counter. "It would cut off the water supply to the north pasture. I'd lose a third of the grazing land." Clara set down the spoon she was holding. This was not a kitchen problem. This was a real problem, the kind that could unravel a ranch and everything built on it. "What does your attorney say?" she asked. "Says I have a case," Nathan said. "Says it could take 6 months and $600 in legal fees to make it." He looked at the counter. "I don't have $600 free." The kitchen was very quiet. "Tell me about the original claim," Clara said. "The one you filed." He looked up. "Why?" "Because I want to understand it," she said. "Tell me the boundary lines. When you filed, what was the upper boundary of the water rights claim?" He looked at her for a moment, with the slightly bewildered expression of a man who has come home tired and troubled, and is now unexpectedly being asked a question that requires him to think. Then he told her. The details of it, the survey markers, The dates, the filing at the county seat in 1879. She listened without interrupting, and while he talked she was moving through the kitchen with the efficiency of someone who listens better when her hands are occupied, setting the kettle on, pulling the supper forward, and her mind was doing something with the information he was giving her that she wasn't quite ready to share yet. "The Hollis brothers," she said when he was done. "They own the property that borders yours to the north." "They do," he said. "And before they filed this claim, was there a dispute between you?" Nathan's expression shifted slightly. "There's always been dispute," he said. "Hollis Sr., their father, and my father had a disagreement about boundary lines going back 15 years. After the old man died, his boys took it up." He paused. "About 2 months ago, Clem Hollis came by and offered to buy a section of my north pasture. I told him I wasn't selling." He looked at her. 2 weeks after that, they filed the water claim. Clara poured the tea and set his cup in front of him. "Did anyone witness that conversation?" she said. "When Clem Hollis made the offer?" Nathan looked at her. "Hector was there," he said slowly. "And Hector would say so." "Of course he would," Nathan said. "Hector doesn't lie." "Then what you have," Clara said, sitting down across from him, "is a documented record of a pattern. He offered to buy land you wouldn't sell. You refused. He filed a claim that would damage the value of that land 2 weeks later." She wrapped her hands around her teacup. "That's not a water rights dispute. That's coercion. And a judge would want to know the sequence." Nathan stared at her. She kept her voice steady. "I'm not a lawyer," she said. "I don't know the law here, but I know that a story has a beginning, and the beginning of this story starts with Clem Hollis wanting something and being told no. Your attorney should be building from there." The silence that followed was long and weighted, and had a different quality than the silences that usually lived in this kitchen. Nathan was looking at her the way you look at a map when you found a road on it that you'd missed. "How do you know that?" he said. "My mother's employer at the hotel," she said. "He had a property dispute with his neighbor that went to court the year I was 16. I sat in on 3 of the hearings because it was a small town, and there was nothing else to do, and I paid attention." She paused. "The attorney who won it for him said afterward that the first thing you do in any dispute is establish who wanted what and what happened when they couldn't have it." Nathan was still looking at her. "Send a letter to your attorney tonight," she said. "Tell him to build from the offer and the refusal." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he picked up his teacup. "All right," he said. They sat at the table for a while after that, and she felt the change in the air between them, not dramatic, not loud, but real. The shift of 2 people who have passed through something together and come out the other side, standing slightly closer than they'd been before. She noticed it. She was fairly certain he noticed it too. And neither of them said a word about it because some things in Red Hollow, Colorado were still too new and too carefully held to be spoken out loud just yet. The letter went out to Nathan's attorney the next morning, carried by Hector on his regular run to town, and Clara watched the wagon disappear down the Ridgeline Road and told herself that whatever happened with Clem Hollis and the water rights and the county courthouse was Nathan Cole's business, and not hers. And then she went back inside and started on the morning bread, and thought about it for the rest of the day anyway. Samuel was at his window chair by the time she had the dough going. He had taken to arriving earlier in the mornings, not dramatically earlier, just incrementally, the way a man edges toward something he wants without wanting to admit he wants it. 2 weeks ago he'd come in around 9. This week it was closer to 7:30. She did not comment on this. She simply moved his coffee cup to the windowsill earlier. "You sent the letter," he said. It wasn't a question. "Hector took it this morning," she said. Samuel wrapped both hands around his cup the way he always did. "Clem Hollis is a careful man," he said. His father was the same. "They don't do things without a plan behind the plan." "What do you mean?" Clara said. "The water claim," Samuel said. "It ain't about water. It never was." He looked out the window. "Old Marcus Hollis, the father, he wanted this land going on 30 years. Offered my father twice. Offered me twice after that. Every time we said no. When Nathan took over, Clem came with another offer. He paused. Nathan said no the same way we always did. And now there's a water claim, Clara said. There's a pattern, Samuel said. A Hollis pattern. Make a man's land worth less. Make it hard enough to hold on to, then come in with an offer when he's desperate. He looked at her. They nearly got us in 71 with a grazing dispute. Took my father 2 years and everything he had in savings to fight it. By the time it was done, he was looking at selling just to get out from under it. But he didn't sell, Clara said. No, Samuel said. He didn't. He was quiet for a moment. Because someone helped him find what he'd missed. A neighbor, old Pete Garfield gone, now he came over one evening and sat down at this very table and said, "You're fighting this wrong, Sam. You're defending when you should be advancing." Clara stopped kneading. Clem Hollis is going to come back with another offer, Samuel said. He's done it every time before, and this time he's going to do it while Nathan's tired and the legal fees are piling up and he's already spent a week in Carver Creek. He turned from the window. I just want you to know that, so when it happens, you're not surprised. She started kneading again. You think it'll happen soon, she said. I think Clem Hollis drove past this road twice last week, Samuel said. Hector mentioned it. A man drives past a road twice without stopping, he's working up to stopping. The bread went into the oven. The morning advanced. Nathan came through for breakfast and was quieter than usual. Not the closed-down quiet of the early days, but the occupied quiet of a man with something working in the back of his mind that he hasn't resolved. She put a full plate in front of him and refilled his coffee without being asked, and he looked up once and said, "Thank you," in a way that meant more than the 2 words. The first real blow came 4 days later, and it didn't come from Clem Hollis. It came from the church. Clara had walked into Red Hollow on Friday morning because she needed thread from the dry goods store, and because she had been inside the coal ranch for 2 solid weeks and felt with the particular instinct of a person who knows her own limits that she needed to walk somewhere and be in the world for an hour or 2. She tied her bonnet, told Hector where she was going, and walked the 4 miles with the easy stride of a woman who had made that walk enough times now that her boots had stopped complaining. She was coming out of the dry goods store when Margaret Pierce stepped directly into her path. Margaret Pierce was the kind of woman who always seemed slightly larger than her actual physical dimensions, the kind of presence that a room rearranges itself around, whether the room wants to or not. She was in her mid-50s with iron gray hair and the expression of someone who had decided long ago that the world required correction and had appointed herself to the task. "Miss Whitmore," she said. "Mrs. Pierce," Clara said. She did not step back. "I was hoping to speak with you," Margaret said in the tone of a woman who uses the word hoping to mean the opposite. "Privately, if you don't mind." "I'm on my way back to the ranch," Clara said. "I have bread rising that needs attending to." "This won't take long," Margaret said. She moved slightly to one side, indicating the narrow gap between the dry goods store and the barber shop, and Clara followed her into it, because the alternative was a scene in the middle of the main street, and she had had enough scenes in the middle of this street to last her a good long while. "I'll come to the point," Margaret said once they were out of the direct flow of foot traffic. "What you're doing out at the coal ranch is not appropriate. I'm cooking and keeping house," Clara said. "You're living there," Margaret said. "Alone. With a single man." "His father lives there as well," Clara said. "Samuel Cole hasn't left his room in months," Margaret said. "He hardly counts as a chaperone." "He comes to supper every night now," Clara said pleasantly. "He counted enough to do that." Something moved across Margaret's face, a small recalibration gone as quickly as it arrived. "Regardless," she said, "the appearance of the situation is not appropriate, and appearances in a community like this one matter a great deal. Women who disregard appearances find that it costs them." Clara looked at her directly. "Mrs. Pierce," she said, "I came to Red Hollow to start a new life after a man publicly withdrew a promise he'd made to me in writing. I took the only work that was available to me. I have spent 2 weeks in a kitchen doing honest work for honest wages. If this community has decided that is an inappropriate way for a woman to conduct herself, I would respectfully suggest that the community has its attention pointed in the wrong direction. Margaret blinked. People were perhaps not usually this direct with her. Furthermore, Clara said, Samuel Cole is eating full meals for the first time in 4 months. Nathan Cole's household is being managed. Whatever the town thinks about my presence there, the family I work for is better off than when I arrived. That seems to me to be the relevant measure. You're a very confident woman, Margaret said with a tone that suggested this was not a compliment. No, Clara said. I'm a very tired one. Good morning, Mrs. Pierce. She walked back out onto the main street and did not look back. But her hands were not entirely steady on the walk home, and she was honest enough with herself to know why. Not because Margaret Pierce frightened her, but because Margaret Pierce was not wrong about one thing. Appearances mattered in a small town, and the appearance of this situation had the potential to do real damage not to her reputation, which she had arrived in Red Hollow without, but to Nathan's. And to the ranch. And to everything she had spent 2 weeks carefully, painstakingly building back toward something like a life. She was still working through it when she got back to the ranch and found Nathan standing at the kitchen table with a piece of paper in his hand and an expression on his face that she had not seen before. "What is it?" she said. He looked up. "Clem Hollis came by while you were in town," he said. He set the paper on the table. He left a written offer. She came and looked at it. The number at the bottom was substantial, not what the land was worth, but substantial enough to be tempting to a man staring down 6 months of legal fees. "What did you tell him?" she said. "I wasn't here," Nathan said. "Hector told him I'd be back by midday. Hollis left the offer and said he'd ride back tomorrow morning for an answer." He set the paper down. "He said the offer wouldn't stand past tomorrow." "It's a pressure tactic," Clara said. "I know it's a pressure tactic," Nathan said, and there was an edge in his voice not directed at her, but present. The edge of a man who is being squeezed from multiple directions and knows it. "Clara, I have a legal fight that could run 6 months. I have a response from my attorney that says the sequence you suggested is promising but not guaranteed. I have a ranch that needs its north pasture water supply." He pressed both hands flat on the table. "Tell me what I'm missing." "You're not missing anything," she said. "You're seeing it clearly. It's a bad position." He looked at her. "So you think I should sell?" "I didn't say that," she said. "Then what?" She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. "Let me ask you something. Your attorney said the sequence, the offer, the refusal, the water claim was promising. Has he written to the county clerk? Has he actually pulled the Hollis filing and looked at the date against the date of your conversation with Clem?" "I assume—" Nathan started. "Don't assume," she said. "Write to him today. Ask him specifically. Ask him whether the timeline is documented and whether that documentation has been filed with the court." Nathan was looking at her with the expression he got when she said something that shifted something in his thinking that particular stillness. "And tomorrow morning," she said, "when Clem Hollis comes back for his answer, don't be here." He blinked. "What?" "Send Hector," she said. "Have Hector tell him the decision is under legal review and will be communicated through your attorney. Don't give Hollis a person to pressure. Give him a process." The silence that followed was long, and Nathan moved through it slowly, visibly, like a man walking through water. Then he said, "You've thought about this." "I've been thinking about it since your father told me about the pattern," she said. Nathan's head came up. "My father talked to you about this, about the family history with the Hollis property," she said, "about how this has happened before. He wanted me to be prepared." She paused. "He was preparing me to help you." Nathan stared at her, and then something crossed his face that was older and more complex than anything she'd seen from him, yet a mix of things she couldn't fully catalog. But one of them was something that looked a great deal like a man realizing that his father, who had spent 4 months refusing to eat and refusing to live, had found enough reason to think about the future to start trying to protect it. He pushed back from the table abruptly and walked to the window. She let him stand there. After a while he said, "He talked to you." "He did?" she said. "He hasn't talked to me," Nathan said. "Not about the land, not about he stopped talking to me about everything that mattered after Eleanor died. And then after Anna died, he stopped. He just stopped." "He's starting again," Clara said quietly. Nathan stood at the window with his back to her for a long time. Long enough that she thought he was done talking, that this was the end of whatever was happening in this kitchen, and she was beginning to consider quietly getting up to check on the bread. Then he turned around, and his face was open in a way she had never seen it, the flatness gone. The control released, just a man standing in a kitchen looking at her with everything visible at once. "Why did you come here?" he said. It was not the same question people in town were asking. It was a different question entirely. "I needed work," she said. "I told you." "No," he said. "I know why you needed work. I'm asking why you came here, to this house. You could have gone to the hotel in Carver Creek. You could have waited for something else. Why did you walk 4 miles in the dark and knock on a stranger's door before sunrise?" Clara looked at him. She had not been asked this before, not like this, not with this kind of attention behind it. She thought about the honest answer, which she had but had not said aloud to anyone. "Because the boy at the hotel said nobody lasted," she said. "He said the last woman walked off after 3 days because of the quiet. He said your father had given up. And I thought..." She stopped, took a breath. "I thought that if there was a place where everyone had already decided something was unfixable, that was probably the place that needed someone most." The kitchen was very quiet. Nathan Cole looked at her across the room for a long time. "Clara Whitmore," he said, and the way he said her name now was different from the first time he'd said it. Less cautious, more deliberate, like something he was tasting and finding right. "Nathan," she said. "I'm glad you knocked on that door," he said. She felt the warmth move through her chest again, the same one from the other night, the one she had told herself not to examine too closely. It was harder to tell it that tonight. "Write to your attorney," she said. "Tonight." "Yes," he said. And something in his voice said he was not only talking about the attorney. Clem Hollis came the next morning, exactly as promised. The kind of man who arrived when he said he would, because punctuality in a negotiation was a form of pressure. Clara heard the horse from the kitchen and did not go to the window. She kept her hands in the dough and listened to Hector's voice outside low and measured, and Hollis's voice rising slightly with the particular surprise of a man who expected a different reception. The conversation lasted about 4 minutes. Then she heard a horse moving away, not slowly. Hector came through the back door. "He's gone," he said. "How did he take it?" she said. "About like you'd expect," Hector said. He poured himself a cup of water from the pitcher. "He said Nathan was making a mistake. I told him Mr. Cole's position would be communicated through his attorney, and that further discussions should be directed there." He looked at her with something that was almost amusement. "You want to know what he said after that?" "Not particularly," Clara said, though she did. "He said, 'Who the hell is running this ranch?'" Hector set the cup down. "And then he left." Clara turned back to the dough. "Good question, though," Hector said, and she could hear him grinning even without looking. Then he went back outside, and she was alone in the kitchen again with the bread in the stove and the sound of the ranch moving around her. The letter from the attorney came 6 days later. She was in the kitchen when Hector brought it in, and she could tell from the way Nathan opened it, standing at the table, not sitting, that he had been composing himself for whatever was inside. He read it again. Then he set it down and was still for a moment. "Well," Samuel said from his chair by the window, because he had been there all morning and was not going to pretend he wasn't interested. "He found something," Nathan said. He looked at the letter. "The Hollis filing date is 11 days after Clem came here with the purchase offer. My attorney's been in contact with the county clerk. There's a notation on file, a preliminary inquiry about the water claim dated 3 days before Clem came with the offer. Clara's hands stilled. "He was planning the claim before he made the offer," Nathan said. "He came here knowing I'd refuse so he could have an excuse to file. He needed a documented interaction to point to later." Nathan looked up. "My attorney says this changes the legal footing considerably. The claim looks retaliatory, and retaliatory water claims in this jurisdiction have been overturned twice in the past 4 years." Samuel made a sound in his chair that was equal parts satisfaction and vindication. "He also says," Nathan continued reading from the letter, "that if I can afford to hold the claim for 90 days without settling, the pattern will be strong enough to bring before the district judge, and he says, not guarantees that we have a better than even chance." "Can you hold for 90 days? Clara asked. Nathan folded the letter. "If I'm careful," he said. "If nothing else breaks, and I don't take on new expenses." He looked at her. "I'll need to reduce wages across the board for a few months. Hector's already agreed to it. I was going to talk to you about—" "Don't," she said. He stopped. "Keep my wages as they are," she said. "I don't need you to reduce them. If you're going to fight this, you need the household running well. A household doesn't run well on reduced food, and a cook who's worried about money." Nathan looked at her. "Clara, I can't." "You're not doing me a favor," she said. "I'm telling you what makes practical sense. Let the ranch run right. Fight the legal battle. Those are the two things." She met his eyes. "I've managed on very little before. I can manage on what you're paying me. Don't touch it." Samuel made a sound that was almost a laugh. It was the closest to a laugh she had ever heard from him. Nathan looked at his father and then back at Clara with the expression of a man who has just realized he is outnumbered in a way he doesn't entirely mind. "All right," he said. "Thank you." "Write to your attorney," she said. "Tell him to proceed." The night that changed everything began as most of them did simply. It was the 4th week of her time at the coal ranch, a Friday evening in late August, when the air had finally started to hint at fall cooler after dark, with the smell of the mountain moving down through the valley, the way it did at the turn of the season. She had made a pot roast that evening, low and slow all day, with the last of the summer garden carrots and some dried herbs and a splash of the vinegar. Samuel had mentioned his wife used to add, which had made Samuel look at the pot with an expression that was trying very hard to be neutral and failing. Supper had been good, genuinely good, the kind of meal that makes a table feel like a proper place. Samuel had eaten 2 full servings and made a sound about the carrots that she had privately ranked among the highest praise she'd received in her professional life. Nathan had eaten with the focused attention of a man who eats well now and has not forgotten what it was like to eat badly. After supper, Samuel had gone to his room, but not with the heaviness of before, more like a man who has had a good day and is going to sleep on it. Nathan had stayed at the table. That was becoming a pattern too. After Samuel went to bed, Nathan stayed at the table, sometimes with coffee, sometimes with nothing, and she would be doing the washing up or the preparations for the next morning, and they would talk. Or sometimes not talk. And both were a kind of conversation. That evening he said, "I got a letter from a woman in town today. She was at the sink." "Oh," she said. "Margaret Pierce," he said. Her hands did not slow in the wash water. "What did she say?" "She said—" He paused, and she heard him pick up his coffee cup and set it back down. "She said she was writing out of concern for my father's welfare and for the reputation of the Cole family, and that my current domestic arrangement was generating significant comment in town, and that she hoped I would consider a more appropriate solution." He paused again. "She suggested I speak to Dorothy Ames, who is recently widowed and a good cook." Clara kept washing. "I folded the letter and put it in my coat pocket," Nathan said. "All right," she said. "And then I took it out and read it again," he said, "because I wanted to make sure I wasn't overreacting to something I'd misread the first time." "And were you?" she said. "Overreacting?" "No," he said. "I wasn't." She finished the dish she was washing, set it in the rack, picked up the next one. "Clara," he said. She turned. He was sitting at the table with his coffee cup between his hands and an expression on his face that was one of the most straightforward she had seen from him. Not closed, not controlled, just open and direct, and a little bit careful. The way a man is careful when he is about to say something that matters. I want you to know that Margaret Pierce's letter did not make me want to speak to Dorothy Ames, he said. The kitchen was very quiet. It made me want to be very clear, he said, about what it is I actually want, because I have not been particularly clear about that, to you or to anyone else. He set the coffee cup down. And I think I should be. She held the dish towel in both hands. She did not look away. I want you to stay, he said. Not because you're a good cook, though you are. Not because my father has come back to himself since you arrived, though he has. Not because you've helped me think through the Hollis problem in ways I wouldn't have found on my own. He stopped, started again. I want you to stay, because when I walk into this kitchen in the morning, it is the first time in 2 years that I've wanted to be anywhere. He met her eyes. And I don't think that has anything to do with the bread. She did not say anything for a moment. Nathan, she said, you should know something about me. Tell me, he said. I have spent most of my life being told that I am not quite what someone was looking for, she said, in various ways and by various people. And I have made a kind of peace with that. But it means I am careful about what I believe when someone tells me something. She looked at him directly. I am not saying I don't believe you. I'm saying it is very new, and I have been wrong before about what people meant, and I am going to hold this carefully for a little while. He looked back at her steadily. That's fair, he said. I can wait. I know you can, she said. That's one of the things about you. He almost smiled. She watched it happen, the slow way his face moved toward it, and then arrived not all the way but further than he'd been. One of the things about me, he said. There's a list, she said, and turned back to the dishes. He laughed. It was the first time she had heard him laugh. Not loud, not long, just a breath of sound that was warm and genuine and startled out of him. And she felt it land in her chest, in the place where the warm thing lived, and she kept her back to him so he wouldn't see her face just then. Good night, Clara, he said, when she was nearly done with the washing up. Good night, Nathan, she said. She heard him leave, heard his footsteps go down the hall, up the stairs, across the ceiling. She stood at the sink with her hands in the cooling water for a minute that felt longer. And then she heard something she didn't expect. Footsteps. Not Nathan's. Those were already above her. These were coming from the hallway on this floor, slow, deliberate. The gate she knew. Samuel Cole appeared in the kitchen doorway in his nightshirt and suspenders. She turned. He had an expression on his face that was something she had not seen there before. Not the grief, not the careful measuring look, not the neutrality he used as a default. It was something older than all of those. Warmer. The expression of a man who has just witnessed something and has decided to say so. He laughed, Samuel said. He did, Clara said. Samuel was quiet for a moment. I have not heard that boy laugh, he said, in 2 years. He looked at her across the kitchen with those light gray eyes, and she saw in them something that had been building for 4 weeks and was now complete enough to be named. You did that, he said. He did it himself, she said. I was just here. That's exactly what Eleanor used to say, Samuel said quietly. When I'd thank her for something, she'd say she just was here. He was still looking at her. She meant it to be modest. I don't think either of you understood that just being here is sometimes the hardest and the rarest thing in the world. Clara stood at the sink with the dish towel in her hands and felt something move through her that was too large and too complicated for a kitchen on a Friday evening in late August. Go to bed, Mr. Cole, she said, and her voice was level enough that she was proud of it. Samuel almost smiled. Good night, Clara Whitmore, he said. Good night, Samuel, she said. He moved back down the hallway, slow and deliberate, and she listened until his door closed. She stood in the kitchen for a long time after that. Outside, the mountain air was coming down through the valley, turning everything a degree cooler. The stove was banked for the night. The dishes were done. The kitchen was clean and quiet, and smelled still faintly of the pot roast and the herbs and the bread from that morning. She stood there in the middle of it and felt for the first time in a long time, longer than she could accurately measure, that she was standing in the right place at the right time, and that the right place was something a person sometimes had to walk 4 miles in the dark to find. She turned down the lamp. She went to her room off the kitchen, and she lay down on her narrow bed, and the night outside was cool and mountain clean, and she did not dream of her mother's kitchen this time. She just slept deeply, and without interruption, in the way a person sleeps when they have begun finally, and without quite knowing when it happened, to feel at home. She woke the next morning with the particular clarity that comes after a sleep so complete it resets something in a person. The kitchen was cold. The overnight temperature had finally made good on its threat of fall, and she had the stove going and the coffee on before her mind had fully organized itself into the day. Nathan came down earlier than usual. She heard him on the stairs before the light was fully established outside, and when he came through the kitchen doorway, he looked like a man who had not slept badly, but had slept with something on his mind that was still there in the morning. He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them said anything about the previous evening, but the previous evening was present in the kitchen with them as clearly as the smell of the coffee, and they both knew it. "Morning," he said. "Sit down," she said. "There's eggs if you want them." He sat. She made the eggs. She put the plate in front of him and poured his coffee, and sat down across from him with her own cup, and the morning moved around them in its ordinary way, and it was the most comfortable ordinary thing she had experienced in longer than she wanted to calculate. "I'm going to ride out to the north pasture today," he said. "Check the water flow from the upper creek. I want to document what the current output is before the legal process advances any further." He paused. "Physical evidence, not just dates and filings." "That's smart," she said. "I want Hector to come with me," he said. "As a witness. Can you manage the morning without him?" "I've been managing," she said. He almost smiled again. It was becoming less, almost. "I know you have," he said. He left after breakfast, and the morning settled into its pattern around her. Samuel came to his chair. She made bread. She started a pot of beans that would be ready by afternoon. The ranch moved in its rhythms outside the sounds of animals and work, and the particular quality of a late summer morning in Colorado that was already beginning to feel like September. She was shaping the second loaf of bread when Samuel said without preamble, "Margaret Pierce is going to do more than write letters." Clara kept working the dough. "What do you mean?" "I mean, that woman has been managing the social architecture of this town for 20 years, Samuel said. "She doesn't write letters and then stop. The letter was the warning. The next thing will be something that lands harder." He paused. "She did the same thing to the Denny family when Tom Denny brought a Cheyenne woman home. Wrote letters first. Then she organized the church auxiliary. Then she went to the business owners. By the end of that winter, Tom Denny couldn't get credit at the general store." Clara's hands slowed. "I'm not telling you this to frighten you," Samuel said. "I'm telling you because you should know what kind of woman you're dealing with." She pressed the heel of her hand into the dough and turned it. "What would she want?" she asked. "Specifically, she'd want you gone from this ranch," Samuel said simply. "She'd call it propriety. But Margaret Pierce has had her eye on matching Nathan up with one of the suitable women in her circle since Anna died. There are 2 or 3 women whose mothers have been very attentive to that project." He looked out the window. "You arriving and staying and things getting better here, which people have noticed they can't help but notice, that changes the picture she's been arranging." Clara turned the bread into the pan and covered it. She stood with her hands flat on the table for a moment. "You've thought about this a lot," she said. "I've had a lot of time to think," Samuel said. "Lying in that room for 4 months, I thought about a good many things." He looked at her, including what it would mean if someone came to this house and didn't leave. She looked at him. "I didn't know what that would look like," he said. "I wasn't hoping for anything specific. I'd stopped doing that." He shifted in his chair. "But I knew that if the right person came, not a good person, there are plenty of good people, but the right person, the kind that stays when it's hard and finds what's needed and does it without needing to be asked if that person came, I would know it." The kitchen was very quiet. "I knew it the morning after you came," he said, "when I picked up the tray from the hallway and brought it inside and ate every drop of that soup." He paused. "I knew it wasn't the soup." Clara pressed her lips together. She was not going to cry in Samuel Cole's kitchen on a Thursday morning. She was simply not. "Samuel," she said. "I know," he said. "Don't make it into more than it is. I'm just an old man who's telling you that you belong here, in case nobody's told you that yet." He reached for his coffee cup. "Someone should." She turned back to the stove so he wouldn't see her face. She kept herself busy through the morning with the kind of focused physical work that doesn't leave room for feeling things too completely. The beans needed tending. The floor needed sweeping. There were 2 shirts of Nathan's she'd been meaning to mend and hadn't gotten to, and she sat with them at the kitchen table in the early afternoon and worked the needle through the fabric with the precise, careful attention of a woman applying herself to something small, because the large things require more than she has right now. Nathan and Hector came back in the mid-afternoon. She heard them before she saw them. Heard the horses, heard Hector's voice saying something sharp and quick. Heard Nathan's response, which was also quick, and had an edge to it that was different from his usual measured tone. They came in through the back door, and both of them had the specific look of men who have found something they expected to find, but were still angered by the finding. "Tell me," she said. "Someone's been at the Upper Creek," Nathan said. "There's a diversion dam been started, rough work, probably done at night, maybe 2 weeks ago from the look of it. It's not finished, but it doesn't need to be finished. Even partial, it's enough to reduce the flow into my north pasture by 1/3. Clara set down the mending. "The Hollis brothers." "Their property borders the creek on the north side," Hector said. "Ain't nobody else." "Can you photograph it?" Clara said. "Document it before anything else happens to it." Nathan and Hector looked at each other. "I don't have a camera," Nathan said. "The photographer in town does," she said. "Eldon Marsh. I saw his sign when I walked in last week. If you can get him out to the property tomorrow, you have physical evidence of active interference, not just a filing, an actual act." She stood. "That's different from a legal dispute. That's potentially criminal interference with water rights." Nathan was looking at her with that expression again, the one that was still deciding things, and was further along in the deciding than it used to be. "Hector," he said. "I'll ride into town tonight," Hector said. "Get Marsh. I'll bring him out first thing tomorrow." "Tell him I'll pay double his usual rate," Nathan said. Hector was already getting his hat. When Hector left, Nathan stood in the kitchen and looked at Clara with the full force of an attention that had no flatness in it at all anymore. "You didn't even pause," he said. "I've been thinking about what they might do next," she said. "Since your father told me about the pattern." She paused. "A legal claim is one thing. Active interference is something they'd only do if they thought you were going to fight the claim and win." "Which means they're worried," Nathan said. "Which means they know more about the strength of your case than you thought," she said. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and stopped in front of her, and she looked up at him. He was a tall man. She had always known that, but right now his height felt like something different from a physical fact. And he said, "Clara." "Nathan," she said. "When this is over," he said. "When this is over," she said. "We can talk about when this is over." He looked at her for a long moment. "Fair enough," he said, in the voice that meant he understood she was right and was not going to push. Then he stepped back, and she breathed again and went to check the beans. The photographer came the next morning. Eldon Marsh was a small, precise man in his 30s, with an impressive mustache and the slightly distracted air of someone whose mind is mostly occupied with light and composition. He rode out with Hector before sunrise, and was back by mid-morning with 12 photographic plates that documented the partial diversion dam from 6 different angles, including 2 that clearly showed where the construction had crossed onto Cole property. Nathan sent everything the photographs. Hector's written testimony about the offer and refusal, the sequence of dates, the attorney's analysis, to the county seat by express mail that afternoon. His attorney had been waiting for physical evidence. Now he had it. 90 days, Nathan said at supper that night. That's what he said. If we can hold 90 days, we have a case. How long has it been? Samuel asked. 31 days since the original filing, Nathan said. Then we hold, Samuel said with the straightforward certainty of a man who has been waiting 4 months to have something to hold for. It was at that supper that Clara noticed something different in the way Samuel was sitting. Not the slow, careful posture of a recovering man, but something more natural, more settled, the way a person sits when they've stopped reminding themselves to sit up and are just sitting. His color was better. His hands, which had trembled slightly in the first week, were steady on his fork. She noticed. She didn't say anything. She just refilled his water glass and let it be. The change in the house had not gone unobserved by Red Hollow. She understood this from the accumulation of small signals, the way Hector mentioned things people had said to him in town, the way certain riders slowed on the ridgeline road as they passed. The way the boy at the dry goods counter had started being notably more attentive when she came in to purchase provisions. Word traveled in a small town the way water traveled downhill. It found every available channel, and it arrived everywhere eventually. What was traveling this time was harder to categorize than gossip about impropriety, which was simpler and moved faster. What was traveling now was the kind of information that people resist for a while and then can't avoid, that the Cole ranch was different. That Samuel Cole had been seen in town for the first time in 6 months, because he had walked to the end of the ridgeline road and back with Nathan one evening, a short walk carefully managed, but a walk. That Nathan Cole had been heard laughing at the hardware store, which Clem Howard at the hardware store mentioned to 3 separate people because it was notable enough to mention. That the kitchen at the Cole ranch, which had been cold for 2 years, was warm. Margaret Pierce was paying attention to all of it. The blow came on a Wednesday, and it came through a channel Clara hadn't fully anticipated. She was in town for her regular Thursday trip. She had moved it to Wednesday this week because she wanted to check on a special order of cinnamon she'd placed for Samuel, who had mentioned once, with the careful offhandedness of a man trying not to want things, that Eleanor used to make cinnamon bread on the first cold morning of fall when she walked past the church and nearly ran into Dorothy Ames. Dorothy Ames was everything Margaret Pierce's letter had implied. A neat, quiet woman in her mid-30s, recently widowed, with a gentle face and the soft, slightly uncertain manner of someone who had been recently reshaped by loss and was not yet sure of the new form. She looked at Clara with no hostility at all, which was somehow worse than hostility. "Miss Whitmore," she said. "I'm Dorothy Ames." "I know who you are," Clara said, and kept her voice kind, because it wasn't Dorothy Ames's fault. "How are you doing, Mrs. Ames?" "I'm managing," Dorothy said with the honesty of someone who means exactly that, not well, not badly, just managing. She paused. "I want you to know that I didn't. Margaret asked me to call on the Cole ranch last week and I didn't go. I wanted you to know that." Clara looked at her. "Why are you telling me this?" Dorothy looked briefly at the church door behind her, then back. "Because I know what it's like to arrive somewhere and find that people have already made decisions about you," she said quietly. "My husband and I came to Red Hollow from Ohio 6 years ago. It took 3 years before people stopped calling us newcomers." She paused. "I don't think Margaret means badly. I just think she's made a picture in her head of how things should go, and she doesn't tolerate things that don't fit the picture." "I appreciate you telling me," Clara said. "She's planning something," Dorothy said. "I don't know exactly what, but she asked Reverend Aldrich to come to tea on Friday, and Margaret only has the Reverend to tea when she wants him to do something." She looked at Clara with those soft, grieved eyes. "I thought you should know." Clara held that for a moment. "Thank you, Mrs. Ames," she said. "Genuinely." Dorothy nodded once and went back into the church, and Clara stood on the street in the September air and thought about the Reverend Aldrich and Friday tea, and what a woman like Margaret Pierce would want from a reverend. She walked to the dry goods store. She collected her cinnamon. She walked home. She did not tell Nathan that evening. She needed to think about it first, about what it was, about what it meant, about what she could do and what she couldn't. She had always believed that the best response to someone making arrangements against you was to make better arrangements for yourself. but she needed to understand the board before she could see the moves. The thinking took 2 days. On Friday evening, when she was fairly certain the Reverend's tea had happened, she sat down at the kitchen table after supper with Nathan across from her and his father in the window chair, and she told them both what Dorothy Ames had said. Nathan was quiet for a moment after she finished. "What do you think she's planning?" he asked. "I think she's going to ask Reverend Aldrich to speak to you," Clara said. "Privately. About the situation here, about propriety and the church's concern for the Cole family." She paused. "It won't be a confrontation. It'll be careful, expressed as concern, framed as community care." "And what will it actually be?" Samuel said from his chair. "Pressure," Clara said. "Targeted pressure. Because a direct attack on me doesn't work, I don't have a reputation here to damage, and I'm not part of the church community. But a quiet conversation between a reverend and a man who grew up in that church about the kind of man that man wants to be seen as, that has a different weight." Nathan's jaw had tightened slightly. "She's going around you," he said. "Coming at me instead. She's smarter than I gave her credit for," Clara said, which was honest. Nathan was quiet for long enough that she began to wonder what was happening behind the controlled exterior. Then he said, "What do you want me to do?" She looked at him. The question landed differently than it would have 3 weeks ago, the particular quality of it, the "what do you want?" the centering of her in the decision. "I want you to do what's true," she said. "When the Reverend comes, if he comes, I want you to say what's true about why I'm here and what this house is and what it isn't. Not what's defensive, what's true." "And what is true?" Nathan said, looking at her with complete directness. "That I came here for work," she said. "That I've done that work, that your father is better, that your household is functioning, and that what you do or don't do with your own life is a matter between you and God, and no one else in Red Hollow gets a vote." She held his gaze. "Say it plainly. Don't apologize for it. Don't explain it more than it needs explaining." He looked at her for a long time. "You're not afraid of her," he said. It wasn't quite wonder, but it was adjacent. "I'm not afraid of a woman who mistakes arranging things for understanding them," Clara said. "I've met versions of Margaret Pierce my whole life. They mistake your quiet for agreement. I've never agreed." Samuel made the sound that was almost a laugh again. Reverend Aldrich came on Tuesday. She knew he was coming before Nathan told her she saw the Reverend's horse on the road from the kitchen window and kept her hands in the bread dough and her expression level. Nathan met him on the porch. She heard the low run of voices she couldn't make out words, wasn't trying to, and the conversation lasted about 30 minutes by her estimation. Then she heard a single set of footsteps on the porch, not two, and the sound of a horse leaving. Nathan came into the kitchen. He sat at the table. She waited. "He was kind about it," Nathan said. "He's a kind man, Aldrich. He said he was coming as a friend, not in an official capacity. Said some people in the community had expressed concern." He paused. "I told him what you said to tell him. He listened. He asked if I was certain about my feelings regarding the situation." He stopped again. "I told him I had never been more certain of anything." Clara pressed the dough, turned it, pressed again. "He shook my hand when he left," Nathan said. "Said he thought I was a good judge of character and he'd pray for the ranch." A pause. "I don't think that's the answer Margaret Pierce was looking for." "No," Clara said. "It isn't." "She's going to push harder," Nathan said. "Let her," Clara said, and she sounded more certain than she felt, but only slightly, and only because the other option, uncertainty visible and unguarded, felt like something she could not afford right now. The push came harder on Friday. It came in the form of a gathering. She learned about it from Hector, who learned about it from the boy at the feed store, who had heard it from his mother, who was part of the church auxiliary. Margaret Pierce had organized what she was calling a community social at the town hall to be held that Saturday, ostensibly a harvest celebration, which was a legitimate enough reason for a gathering in late September in any frontier town. But the guest list was specific, and it included Nathan Cole, and the program included a pointed section about community values and family standards in Red Hollow. And there were reportedly several mothers bringing several daughters. All of them single, all of them from established local families. Hector told her this with the slightly pained expression of a man delivering information he knows is going to land badly. It did not land badly. It landed with a clarity that was almost in a strange way, a relief. "All right," Clara said. "All right," Hector said. "It's a public gathering," she said. "Anyone in Red Hollow can attend a public gathering." She looked at Hector. "Can't they?" He looked back at her for a moment. Then the almost grin appeared. "Far as I know," he said. "Then I'll attend," she said. Hector blinked. "You're going to—" "I'm going to the harvest social," she said. "As a resident of Red Hollow, which I am. As an employed woman in this community, which I am." She turned back to the stove. "Margaret Pierce doesn't own public spaces." Hector left without another word, and she heard him laughing somewhere near the barn. She told Nathan at supper. He was quiet for a long moment. Samuel at his chair was not quiet at all. He made a sound of flat, decisive approval that was the loudest she had ever heard from him. "You're certain?" Nathan said. "No," she said, "but I'm going." He looked at her. "I'll drive you in," he said. "Nathan, I'll drive you in," he said again, and the way he said it the second time was different from the first, quieter, more deliberate the way he said things when he had thought them through completely and was not going to revise them. She looked at him across the table, at the man who had opened his door before sunrise 6 weeks ago, and looked at her with gray-green eyes that were cold and had been getting warmer every day since. At the man who had written a note when he left so she would know why the kitchen was empty. At the man who had heard what Margaret Pierce said about her and decided what he thought about it without consulting Margaret Pierce. "All right," she said. Samuel reached for his bread. "Good," he said, as if that settled it, because to Samuel Cole it apparently did. Saturday arrived with the specific quality of a day that matters. Clara had learned to recognize these the days that have a different weight to them from the beginning, that feel slightly more real than the days around them. She wore her best dress, which was not fine by any measurement Red Hollow would have used, but was clean and well kept and fit her properly, which she had always believed was worth more than finery that didn't. She did her hair with care. She stood in front of the small mirror in her room off the kitchen and looked at herself for a moment, a plus-size woman in a blue dress with her hair pinned and her back straight, and she thought, "This is who I am. And I am walking into that room exactly like this. And Margaret Pierce is going to have to look at me standing there and find something else to organize, because I'm not leaving." Nathan was waiting with the wagon when she came out. He was in his good coat. She hadn't seen him in his good coat before, and he had shaved, which was notable. And when she came out the door, he looked at her with an expression that had no ambiguity in it whatsoever. "You look," he said, and then seemed to run out of words in a way that was itself a kind of statement. "Thank you," she said, and took his offered hand to climb up to the wagon seat. They drove the 4 miles to Red Hollow in the early evening, and the air smelled of fall, and the mountains were going gold at the edges, and she sat beside Nathan Cole on the wagon seat with the town coming closer, and thought 6 weeks ago I walked this road carrying a suitcase and a letter that called me an inconvenience. She reached into her coat pocket and touched the letter. Still there. She had carried it every day. She was not sure yet whether she was carrying it as a reminder of what she'd survived, or a reminder of where she'd come from, or simply because she had not yet decided to let it go. Maybe all three. The town hall was lit up when they arrived, music from inside audible even in the street, and Nathan came around to help her down from the wagon with the particular care of a man who has decided to be deliberate about this. And when she took his arm as they walked toward the door, she felt the slight shift in how he held himself straighter. Something settled in him, the posture of a man who has made a decision and is enacting it. The room rearranged itself when they walked in, not loudly, not dramatically, but she felt it. The small cascade of attention, the adjustment of conversations, the moment of collective recalibration that happens when something enters a room that is not quite what was expected. She walked beside Nathan Cole through the door of the Red Hollow Town Hall and looked straight ahead, and did not make herself smaller by so much as a half inch. Margaret Pierce was across the room. Their eyes met. Margaret's face went through a sequence of responses that were too fast and too controlled to read completely, but Clara caught the important ones. Surprise because she had not expected this. Calculation because that was how Margaret Pierce processed surprises. And then something else. Something older than either of those, something that looked for just a flash-like recognition. Clara held her gaze steadily. Did not smile. Did not look away. Simply looked back the way a woman looks at another woman when she needs her to understand that she is not afraid and is not leaving. Margaret Pierce looked away first. Nathan felt it. She knew he did because his hand moved slightly over hers where it rested on his arm, a small deliberate pressure. "All right," he said quietly. "Yes," she said. And then Mabel Greer, the thin woman from the stage arrival, the one with the bonnet who had told her she was a journey made for nothing, stepped forward with a plate of something and said in a voice that had something new in it, something cautious and recalibrated, "Miss Whitmore, I heard Samuel Cole has been eating well." Clara looked at her. "He has," she said. "He came for a walk down the road last week for the first time in 6 months. He's doing better every day." Mabel blinked. This was apparently not the response she had prepared for. "Well," she said, that's very good to hear." "It is," Clara said. "Would you excuse us?" And she moved forward into the room beside Nathan Cole in her blue dress, with her back straight into the Harvest Social in Red Hollow, Colorado, on a Saturday evening in September of 1883, and she was exactly who she was, and she took up exactly the space she occupied, and she did not apologize for a single inch of it. Margaret Pierce watched her from across the room. And if she was recalculating, Clara did not wait around to see what she calculated. She had a room to walk through, and she was going to walk through it. The room did not silence when they walked in, but it changed. That was the more accurate word for it. The Harvest Social in Red Hollow's Town Hall did not stop for Clara Whitmore and Nathan Cole, but it shifted the way a current shifts when something enters the water, and she felt that shift move through the room from the door to the far wall and back again. Nathan stayed close. Not hovering, he was not a hovering man, but present in a way that was deliberate. His arm steady under her hand, his body angled slightly toward her in the way of a man who has decided where his attention is and is not concealing it. People looked. Some looked away quickly. Some did not. Clem Howard from the hardware store came over within the first 10 minutes and shook Nathan's hand and said something about the water rights case that had apparently become known enough around town to be a topic of normal conversation. And he looked at Clara with the slightly overcorrected friendliness of a man who has said something about her previously that he is not proud of. She accepted it with the grace of someone who understands that people correct themselves slowly and imperfectly, and that this is still better than not correcting at all. The music was a fiddle and a guitar. 2 men in the corner playing the kind of songs that a room full of frontier people plays at a Harvest Social. Not refined, not particularly polished, but alive in the way that music made by people. In a room for other people in a room is always alive in a way that more practiced music sometimes isn't. Margaret Pierce did not come near them. Clara watched her from the peripheral vision she had developed over years of being the person in a room that other people were watching, that slight, careful awareness of where attention was coming from and going to. Margaret was on the other side of the hall, surrounded by her usual group, and her manner had a quality that Clara recognized as the composure of a woman who has had her plans disrupted and is deciding on revision rather than retreat. That was the thing about Margaret Pierce that Clara had understood from the beginning. She was not a woman who accepted outcomes. She revised and redirected and came back from a different angle, and she would do it again tonight, or she would do it next week or the week after that, but she would do it. The question was not whether Margaret was done. The question was whether Clara and Nathan were prepared for the next form it took. She was thinking about this when Dorothy Ames appeared at her elbow. "You came," Dorothy said quietly, with the expression of someone who had hoped for something and had not quite believed it would happen. "I said I would," Clara said. Dorothy looked at Nathan, who had been pulled into a conversation with 2 ranchers from the north side of the valley, then back at Clara. "How is it," she asked, "being here?" Strange, Clara said honestly. And also, not as strange as I thought it would be. Dorothy nodded slowly. Margaret spoke with Reverend Aldrich, she said. I imagine you know that. I know it, Clara said. The Reverend came to the ranch. He and Nathan had a conversation. And he shook Nathan's hand when he left, Clara said. Said he'd pray for the ranch. Dorothy's face did something that was trying not to be a smile and losing. She won't like that, she said. I know she won't, Clara said. Dorothy was quiet for a moment, watching the room. She's going to make a speech tonight, she said, at the end of the evening. The mayor usually says a few words at the harvest social, and then Margaret always says a few words after him. This year, she paused. I heard her talking to Helen Marsh this afternoon. She's going to talk about community standards, about what makes Red Hollow the kind of place good families want to build their lives. She looked at Clara. She's going to do it publicly, in front of everyone. Clara held that. She's banking on public embarrassment, she said. Yes, Dorothy said. She thinks if she says it in front of the whole room, Nathan will feel the weight of it more than he would privately. She touched Clara's arm briefly, barely a contact. I wanted you to be ready. Thank you, Clara said. Dorothy, thank you for all of it. Dorothy shook her head slightly. You don't have to thank me for telling the truth, she said, and moved away back into the room. Clara stood for a moment, turning it over. A public speech, community standards, the full room as audience and as pressure. It was, she had to admit, a smarter move than the letter or the Reverend. Margaret Pierce had understood that private pressure on Nathan had not worked and was going for something larger. Nathan came back to her side within a few minutes, and she could tell from the slight set of his jaw that one of the ranchers had said something that had not sat entirely well with him. What is it? She asked. Ed Garrity, he said. He told me he heard the water rights case was likely to be thrown out. Said Hollis has friends at the county seat. He paused. He was being conversational about it. He wasn't trying to be unkind. But someone's been talking. Clem Hollis has been talking, she said. Most likely, he said. He looked at her. You heard something. Dorothy Ames told me Margaret Pierce is planning a speech tonight, she said, at the end of the evening, about community standards. His jaw tightened a degree more. Is she? Nathan? She said. Listen to me. She turned slightly so she was facing him more directly, lowering her voice. Whatever she says tonight, I don't want you to respond in anger. I want you to respond with what's true, the same way I said before. Not defensive, not sharp. What's true. And if what's true makes people uncomfortable, he said. Then they're uncomfortable, she said. That's their work to do, not yours. He looked at her for a long moment, and in his face, she saw the thing she had been watching develop over 6 weeks, the slow dissolution of the wall he had built after Anna died, the careful brick-by-brick opening of a man who had closed himself off from everything that could hurt him, and was now learning reluctantly and with immense effort that the same openness that could hurt was the only thing that could also save. All right, he said. The mayor spoke first, as was apparently custom, a round man named Gerald Fitch, who had a natural talent for saying nothing at length with great warmth. He thanked people for coming. He talked about the harvest. He mentioned 2 new businesses coming to town in the spring. He made a joke that everyone laughed at because they were supposed to. Then he sat down. Margaret Pierce stood up. The room did not hush, but attention gathered, which was the same thing in a slightly more polished form. Margaret Pierce had the quality of a woman who commanded attention without demanding it. People looked at her because she expected to be looked at, and that expectation was itself compelling. She began by talking about Red Hollow, about what kind of community it was, and had been, and should be. She was good at this, genuinely good, Clara noted with a fairness she could not help. She spoke with real love for this town, for its history, for the people in it. And nothing she said in the first several minutes was untrue, or even particularly unkind. And then she arrived at the turn. A community's character, Margaret said, is built by its families, by the choices those families make, by the standards they hold themselves to, not because the law demands it, but because they believe their neighbors deserve their best example. She paused. Red Hollow has always been a town that looks after its own, that cares for the families within it, that holds together a shared understanding of what we are. Another pause. It is important when circumstances arise that test that understanding that we speak plainly. The room was fully quiet now. Clara stood beside Nathan and felt his arm under her hand go very still. Margaret turned her gaze across the room. There are situations, she said, that may begin with good intentions and become through inattention or perhaps through a failure to consider what we owe each other as a community, situations that reflect poorly on the values we have built together. I say this not to judge any individual, but because I love this town and I love the families in it, and I believe we serve each other best by speaking plainly about Margaret. The voice was not loud. It did not need to be. Everyone in the room turned. Samuel Cole was standing in the doorway. He had not been there a moment ago. He must have come in quietly, or he had come in during the mayor's remarks and stood at the back and waited, and no one had noticed, because Samuel Cole had not been in public in 6 months, and no one had been looking for him. He was dressed properly, not finely, but properly. His coat buttoned, his hat in his hand, his white hair combed. He looked thinner than he once had, and he was standing with the careful uprightness of a man who was managing the effort of standing and would not show it, and his light gray eyes were absolutely clear. The room was completely silent. Margaret Pierce's mouth had closed. Samuel walked forward through the room. People moved without being asked, opening a path the way people do for someone whose presence has a particular gravity. He walked slowly and deliberately, the same way he walked in the kitchen in the mornings, and he came through the middle of the room and stopped a few feet from Margaret Pierce and looked at her with the expression of a man who has been lying in a bed for 4 months thinking about things and has finally arrived at the moment he was thinking toward. "You were going to say something about my household," he said. It was not a question. Margaret Pierce collected herself with impressive speed. "Samuel," she said warmly, "I didn't know you'd be. I'm so pleased to see you out. It's been so—" "I know what you were going to say," Samuel said. "And I'm going to ask you not to say it." The silence in the room was the kind that has weight. "I am the head of this Cole household," Samuel said. "Not Nathan, not anyone else. Me. My name is on the deed of that land, and it has been for 30 years, and what happens in my household is my business and my family's business, and it is not the business of this gathering or this auxiliary or any other body in Red Hollow, Colorado." He paused. "Clara Whitmore came to my house 6 weeks ago. She came looking for work. She has done that work with more skill and more dignity and more genuine care than anyone who has come through my door in 2 years. She has given me back something I had lost." He stopped. His voice, which had been controlled and level, did something then not breaking, but moving, becoming something that had lived inside it all along and was now simply audible. "I had decided to stop living," he said. "I want you to understand that clearly. I had decided that there was nothing left worth the trouble. And a woman you are standing here about to disparage walked into my kitchen and made soup and left it at my door and didn't ask me for a single thing except that I eat it." He looked at Margaret Pierce steadily. "You want to talk about values, about what this community owes each other. Well, that woman showed me more of what this community's values ought to be in one morning than I have seen in 6 months of people leaving me well enough alone." He looked around the room at Mabel Greer, at Clem Howard, at the faces he had known for 20 and 30 years, each one of them still and watching. "I am grateful to be standing here tonight," he said. "That is not a small thing, and I know whose doing it is." He turned and looked at Clara. She had not moved. She was standing where she had stood throughout beside Nathan, and she was looking at Samuel Cole with an expression she could not have described and would not have tried to. "Come here, girl," Samuel said. She walked forward through the room. He looked at her when she reached him. Looked at her the way he had looked at her that first morning in the kitchen doorway when he'd asked about the soup, but fuller now with 6 weeks of knowing in it. He was not a demonstrative man. He had never in 6 weeks touched her shoulder or her hand, or made any gesture that was more than the ordinary business of shared meals and shared mornings. He took her hand now. Both of his over hers, the hands of an old man who had come back from somewhere far away and knew it. "Thank you," he said. 2 words, the simplest possible construction. She had heard those 2 words used many times in her life, with varying degrees of meaning, and she had never heard them mean as much as they meant right now in Samuel Cole's voice. She squeezed his hands once and let go, because she was not going to cry in the Red Hollow Town Hall in front of everyone, and she needed her hands back for that. "Thank you," she said back, "for coming. Wasn't going to miss it," he said, with the dryness that was his version of warmth, and turned back to the room. Margaret Pierce had not moved. Her face was composed. She was too practiced for it not to be. But something in it had shifted in the way of a building that has had its foundation rearranged and is still standing but will not stand in quite the same way again. She looked at Samuel. She looked at Clara. She looked at Nathan, who was standing exactly where he had stood since his father had walked through that door, watching the whole thing with an expression that was not triumph and was not vindication, and was something quieter and more permanent than either. "Samuel," Margaret said. Her voice was careful. "I'm very glad you're well." "I'm getting there," Samuel said. "Thank you for the concern." It was, Clara thought, a remarkably complete response, accepting the surface of the thing, without conceding anything underneath it. Margaret Pierce recognized it too, because she inclined her head slightly, in the way of a woman who understands, when a hand has been played, that she cannot beat tonight. She did not finish her speech. The mayor, displaying a social instinct Clara had not credited him with, immediately called for another song from the musicians, and the fiddle started up, and the room released its breath in the way rooms do, and conversation started again around them in multiple directions at once. Hector appeared at Samuel's elbow from somewhere she hadn't seen him arrive either, which meant either he had been there all along, or he had come in right behind Samuel, and she suspected the latter, because Hector Reyes was a man who showed up when things mattered. "You need to sit down," Hector told Samuel, with the direct practicality of a man who respects someone too much to be delicate about them. "I know I do," Samuel said. "Find me a chair." Hector found him a chair. Samuel sat. Several people came over to him, in the next few minutes, older men, men who had known him for decades, who shook his hand and said they were glad to see him, and meant it in the straightforward way of frontier men who are not practiced at saying complicated emotional things, but are capable of meaning them. Nathan came to Clara's side. She looked at him. He looked back at her, and his face was the face she had been watching open for 6 weeks, and it was open now as far as it went, which was further than she had known at the beginning that it could go. "Your father walked 4 miles to come here tonight," she said. "I know," Nathan said. "He stood up in a room full of people," she said. "I know," he said again. "For me," she said, and her voice did the thing she'd been preventing it from doing for the last 10 minutes just slightly. "For you," Nathan said, "and for himself. And because he's Samuel Cole, and he doesn't let people say things that aren't true about people who belong to him." She looked at him. "People who belong to him," she repeated. "That's what he said to me," Nathan said, "when I asked him if he was sure about coming tonight. He said, 'She belongs to us, son, and I'm not going to sit in that house while someone talks about my family.'" He paused. "That was the first time he's called anything my family since Anna died." Clara pressed her lips together hard. "Clara," Nathan said. "Don't," she said. "Not right now. I need a minute." "Take all the time you need," he said, and stood there beside her, present and steady, while she found the bottom of the feeling and came back up from it. She took approximately 1 minute. Then she straightened her spine, which had been straight to begin with, but was now straight with intention, and she looked at Nathan Cole in the Red Hollow Town Hall on a Saturday night in September, with the fiddle going, and Samuel sitting in his chair across the room holding court with men who had missed him, and the mountain air coming through the door that someone had left open, and she said, "All right." "All right," he said. "I want to go home," she said. She did not mean the boarding house. She did not mean Wichita. She did not mean anywhere she had ever been before. Nathan looked at her, and she saw in his face that he understood exactly what she meant, and that it was for him the same. "Let's go home," he said. They collected Samuel, who came without protest, because he had done what he came to do and was ready to be finished with it. And Hector brought the wagon around, and the four of them rode the 4 miles back to the Cole Ranch through the September night, with the stars very clear above them, and the mountain air coming down through the valley carrying the smell of pine and cold, and the particular sweetness of a season changing into something new. Samuel fell asleep in the back of the wagon before they were halfway home. His head dropped and his breathing steadied, and he slept the way a man sleeps who has spent a great deal of energy on something important, and is now finished with it and can rest. Hector drove. Clara and Nathan sat side by side on the seat above the wagon bed, and the road moved under them, and the dark opened around them, and neither of them spoke for a long time. "What he said," Nathan said finally, "about you belonging." "I heard it," she said. "He meant it," Nathan said. "He doesn't say things he doesn't mean." "I know he doesn't," she said. "I mean it too," he said, in case that wasn't clear. "It's getting clearer," she said. He reached over and took her hand where it rested on her knee, and she let him, and they rode the rest of the way home like that through the September dark under the Colorado stars, with the mountain coming up black against the sky ahead of them, and the ranch lights showing through the trees before they arrived. The morning 2 weeks later, when the letter came from the attorney, was a Tuesday. She was in the kitchen. Nathan brought it in from where Hector had left it on the porch, and stood at the table and opened it the same way he always opened things from the attorney, now standing, not sitting, because sitting required more patience than he had for these. He read it. She watched his face. He looked up. "The county judge has agreed to review the filing," he said, "based on the photographic evidence and the documented sequence. The attorney's been granted a preliminary hearing." He looked at the letter again. He says the partial diversion dam constitutes criminal interference under Section 14 of the Colorado Water Statutes, and that the judge has asked the Hollis brothers to appear." He set the letter down. He says he expects a ruling within 60 days. Samuel in his chair set down his coffee cup. 60 days, Samuel said. 60 days, Nathan said. "Then we hold," Samuel said. It was exactly what he had said the first time, and it landed the same way, with the calm, total certainty of a man who has stopped being afraid of time because he has finally found a reason to move through it. Clara turned back to the stove. The bread was ready to come out, and she took it out, and the smell of it moved through the kitchen the way it always did, and she set the loaves on the rack and stood there with the oven heat on her face for a moment. She thought about the letter in her pocket, the one that had called her an inconvenience. She reached in and took it out, held it for a moment, looking at the cramped handwriting that had grown smaller as Douglas Hale was writing it, as if he were trying to take up less space in his own cowardice. Then she opened the firebox of the stove and put the letter in. It caught immediately. She closed the firebox and stood up and dusted off her hands and went back to the bread. Nathan was watching her from the table. "What was that?" he asked. "Something I didn't need anymore," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up his coffee cup. "All right," he said, and let it be. The ruling came in 53 days, not 60. The county judge found in Nathan Cole's favor on all counts. The water claim was thrown out as retaliatory. The partial diversion dam was ordered removed at the Hollis brothers' expense, and a notation was entered into the county record regarding the documented pattern of interference with the Cole water rights dating back through the previous generation. The attorney's letter was 6 pages long, and Nathan read all of it twice, and then handed it to Clara, and she read it once, and handed it to Samuel, and he read the first page and set it on his knee and looked out the window for a long time. "Your father would have liked to know this," Clara said to Samuel. "He would have," Samuel said. "He spent 2 years of his life fighting the original version of this." He was quiet for a moment. He'd have liked to know the ranch was still here, still going. He looked at her. He'd have liked to know what changed it. The afternoon Nathan proposed, it was not dramatic, and it was not staged, and there were no other people present to witness it, which was, Clara had come to understand exactly the kind of man he was. She was in the kitchen garden in early October, pulling the last of what the garden had to offer before the first real frost came. A few root vegetables, some hardy herbs, the wild green onions that were still going along the south fence despite everything. She was on her knees in the dirt with her hands working, and her mind somewhere quiet when she heard him come through the gate. She didn't turn around. He stood there for a moment. She could hear him breathing, could feel the particular quality of his presence that she had learned so thoroughly over 10 weeks, that she knew it now, the way she knew the sound of the stove, or the rhythm of the house settling in the cold. "Clara," he said. "Nathan," she said. "I've been thinking about how to say this," he said. "How long?" she said. "A while," he said. "Longer than I knew I was thinking about it." She sat back on her heels and looked up at him. He was looking at her with complete seriousness, not nervous. Nathan Cole was not a nervous man, but serious with the full weight of what he meant behind his eyes. "I'm not going to make a speech," he said. "You know what I'm like. I don't make speeches." "I know what you're like," she said. "I know what you're like too," he said. "I've been watching you for 10 weeks, and I know what you're like. And what you're like is—" He stopped. "You're the kind of person who feeds a man who won't eat and doesn't ask him for anything in return. You're the kind of person who walks 4 miles in the dark to knock on a stranger's door because someone told you nobody lasted. You're the kind of person who burns a letter instead of carrying it around until it makes you smaller." He paused. "I want to spend the rest of my life watching what you do next. I want to do that officially and completely." He looked at her in the October garden with the cold coming down through the mountains and said, "Will you marry me, Clara Whitmore?" It was not quite a question, and not quite not a question. It was the way Nathan Cole said most important things with the steadiness of someone who has thought it through completely and arrived at the only conclusion the facts supported. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about 11 days on a coach, a letter in her pocket, a town that had looked at her and seen an inconvenience, a kitchen door at 6 in the morning, and a man with gray-green eyes who had not smiled but had stepped back and said, "Come in then," and that had been the beginning of everything. "Yes," she said. "Nathan Cole, yes." He reached down and took her hand and pulled her to her feet, and then stood there, holding her hand in both of his, in the October garden, and it was simple, and it was warm, and it was true, and truth Clara had always believed was the thing that lasted when everything else wore out. They were married in November in a simple ceremony at the Cole Ranch, because Samuel said the church was fine, but the ranch was where it had happened, and he wanted it to happen there too. Reverend Aldrich came because he was a kind man, and he had meant it when he said he'd pray for the ranch. Hector stood beside Nathan. Dorothy Ames, who had become the beginning of something that was turning into friendship, stood beside Clara. Margaret Pierce sent a note that said she wished them well. Clara read it, recognized it for what it was, a woman of sufficient character to acknowledge when she had lost gracefully enough, and wrote back a brief, genuine note of thanks. She meant it. She did not require her opponents to be villains. She only required herself to keep standing. The winter was hard, as Colorado winters were, and the ranch work was hard, and there were difficult mornings and long days and problems that did not resolve themselves neatly, because life on a working ranch in 1883 was not a story. It was a life with the full complexity and exhaustion and occasional grace that the word implies. But the kitchen was warm. The table had 3 people at it every night, and sometimes 4 when Hector stayed, and sometimes more when the season brought extra hands to the ranch. Samuel grew stronger steadily, not dramatically incrementally, the way a man recovers who has been genuinely far away and is coming back by choice one day at a time, because he has found reason enough to make the journey. He told Clara once in January on a morning when the snow was coming sideways outside and they were in the kitchen together with the stove going full and the smell of the bread she'd started before dawn already moving through the house. He told her, "I thought about giving up every day for 4 months, and now I think about what comes next." He looked at her across the kitchen, this old man with his light gray eyes and his hands wrapped around his coffee cup. "That's a significant change of direction." "It is," she said. "You pointed me back the other direction," he said. "You walked it yourself," she said. "You keep saying that," he said. "Because it keeps being true," she said. He made the sound that was almost a laugh. She never stopped being grateful for that sound. Spring came. The way spring comes in the mountains, slowly then, all at once. The pastures came back. The kitchen garden, which she had tended through the fall and planned through the winter, came up with more intention and more variety than it had in years she had sent away for seed catalogs in December, and spent 3 evenings with them at the kitchen table, Nathan reading next to her, occasionally looking over to comment Samuel asleep in his chair by the window, with what was, she was increasingly certain, performative sleeping. The north pasture water ran clear and full from the upper creek. The Hollis brothers had removed the diversion dam in January as ordered by the court, in the kind of silence that is louder than most protest. On a morning in April, Nathan came in from the north pasture before breakfast, which was unusual. He was typically out for hours before he came back for the midday meal, and she looked up when he came through the door. "Come outside," he said. "The bread is—" "It'll keep," he said. "Come outside." She wiped her hands and followed him out through the back, around the side of the house, to where the kitchen garden ran along the south wall in the early morning light. The rosemary was blooming. She had not expected it this early, had hoped for, it had checked it through. The winter had seen it surviving, but not yet doing anything beyond surviving. And now it was blooming, the small purple-gray flowers that rosemary makes along its stems, filling the south-facing bed, with a color that was not dramatic, but was in the way of small persistent things, completely itself. She stood looking at it for a moment. "Eleanor planted it," Nathan said beside her. "I know," she said. "It's been through 2 hard winters without much attention," he said. "The one before you came, I didn't touch it, didn't tend it at all, figured it was just going to die out." "Rosemary doesn't give up easily," she said. He looked at her with the look she knew now, as well as she knew anything, the one that said he was seeing her and meant it. "No," he said. "It doesn't." She reached down and touched one of the stems, the small gray-green leaves, the new flowers. She thought about Samuel's soup and the wild green onions, and her mother's kitchen, and 11 days on a coach, and a letter that had burned clean in a firebox on a Tuesday morning in October. She thought about how a person can spend years being told they are not quite what someone was looking for, and can begin without quite noticing. To believe it can begin to move through the world in the slightly apologetic way of someone who has accepted a diminished version of their own life as the most they are owed. And she thought about what it felt like when that stopped, when someone opened a door in the dark and said, "Come in then," and meant it completely, and kept on meaning it, and built on top of it, and one ordinary morning stood beside you in a kitchen garden to show you something that had come back. "Nathan," she said. "Clara," he said. "Thank you for stepping back from that door," she said. "That first morning." He was quiet for a moment. "I almost didn't," he said. "I stood there looking at you, and I thought you weren't going to last either. I thought you'd be gone in 3 days like the rest." "What changed your mind?" she said. "You said I'm not them," he said. "And you said it the way a person says something that's been true their whole life." He paused. "I believed you. I believed." She looked at the rosemary, at the small certain flowers on stems that had survived 2 winters untended, because that was simply what rosemary did. It persisted. It held, it came back when the season was right and put out flowers without being asked, because that was its nature. She believed some people were the same way. She believed she was the same way. She had always believed it, even in the years when Douglas Hale's letter would have argued otherwise, even in the years of too much quiet and not enough belonging, even at the stage stop in Red Hollow, with a suitcase in her hand and a town full of people who had already made their decisions about her. She had always, underneath all of it, believed that she was the kind of thing that persists. She had just needed a door that opened. Clara Whitmore. Cole stood in her kitchen garden on an April morning in 1884, beside the man who had opened that door, and she was exactly who she had always been. The same woman who had stepped off a stagecoach in the dust and swallowed her tears, and decided she would survive without begging anyone for kindness. But she was that woman in a home that was hers, in a life that fit her with people around her who saw her clearly and chose her completely. Not despite who she was. Because of it. And the rosemary bloomed on the south wall of the coal ranch in Red Hollow, Colorado. And the kitchen was warm and the table was full, and Clara Whitmore had not been an inconvenience after all. She had been from the very beginning the whole point.